This story took place in the small town of Conyers, Georgia. The officer immediately called for backup and medical assistance at the scene of the tragedy. Arriving at the address Tasmay provided, the police saw another girl near the house, an exact copy of Tasmay. As it turned out, they were twin sisters, Tasmia and Jasmia. The girls were in a state of shock from what they had seen. They were immediately given first aid, trying to calm and stabilize them. Meanwhile, a group of police officers entered the house to examine the crime scene. Right from the doorstep, their attention was drawn to a long bloody trail stretching from the door to the street. Judging by everything, the victim had tried to escape from the attacker, but he caught up with her and dragged her back into the house to finish his bloody deed. What the cops saw inside shocked even seasoned officers. On the floor, walls, and even the ceiling were brown bloodstains, evidence of a brutal massacre. It seemed as if someone had deliberately splattered blood all over the house. In my years of service, I've seen many crime scenes, but this picture was one of the most terrifying. The officers carefully examined the house room by room, searching for the victim's body and any evidence that could shed light on the identity of the killer. Eventually, in one of the rooms, they found what they were looking for: the mutilated body of 33-year-old Nikki Whitehead, the mother of the twin girls. I can't help but note the diligence with which the killer tried to cover up the traces of his crime. The entire house was literally flooded with blood, but it was clear that someone had tried to clean up, albeit unsuccessfully. To completely cleanse the crime scene in such a short time was practically impossible. Later, Officer Chrisman, one of the first to arrive on the call, admitted that in his entire career he had never seen such a bloody scene. This place made a depressing impression even on hardened cops. During the house search, the body of 33-year-old Nikki Whitehead, the mother of the twin girls, was found in one of the rooms. She was lying in the bathtub in a pool of her own blood. The woman had become a victim of a brutal attack. Her body was literally riddled with numerous stab wounds. Especially horrifying was the fact that the victim's spinal cord was practically severed. It seemed as if the killer had struck this area with particular fury. The expert who arrived at the crime scene counted about 80 stab wounds on the deceased's body. It's hard to even imagine the agony the poor woman endured before her death. It was also strange that the towels from the bathroom had disappeared somewhere. Later, they were found in the washing machine, soaked in blood. It looks like the killer tried to get rid of these pieces of evidence, but in a hurry just shoved them into the machine. On the same day, a criminal case was opened under the murder article, and an active search for the perpetrator began. The first to come under the scrutiny of the investigation were the victim's daughters Tasmia and Jasmia. During interrogation, the girls said that the house where they lived belonged to a man named Robert Head, with whom their mother had a relationship. But as it turned out, Robert was not Nikki's only admirer. The girls recalled overhearing their mother repeatedly talking on the phone with some Nikki Joe, especially when Head wasn't around. This fact interested the investigators and required further verification. Was Robert Head involved in the murder? What role did the mysterious Nikki Joe play? And most importantly, who actually committed this terrible act? Now I'm going to tell you all about this in detail, but only for those wonderful and amazing people who subscribe to the channel right now, like this video, and leave any comment on it. Help me spread this story so people can draw conclusions from this shocking case. So, during the interrogation of the victim Nikki Whitehead's daughters, new details of her personal life were revealed. Tasmia and Jasmia said that they had repeatedly heard their mother talking on the phone with some Nikki Joe, especially when her cohabitant Robert Head was not around. Interestingly, the girls themselves never saw Joe, including on the day of the tragedy. But the most intriguing fact was that on the eve of the murder, Nikki spoke again with this mysterious man, and then a serious quarrel broke out between them, after which the woman angrily slammed down the receiver. This detail immediately caught my attention as a detective. After all, it is quite possible that during that conversation, Nikki told her admirer about her desire to end their relationship, and such a decision could well become a motive for murder. How many times in my practice have I encountered similar situations? A rejected lover commits a crime out of jealousy or resentment. Therefore, this version definitely needed to be checked. The police quickly found Nikki Joe and invited him for questioning. The man was genuinely surprised to learn the reason for the summons. He categorically denied his involvement in the murder and claimed that despite the one-sidedness of his feelings and the fact that Nikki kept him at a distance, he sincerely loved this woman and would never harm her. Joe confirmed that on the eve of the tragedy, he and Nikki really had a quarrel, but assured that it was a minor dispute over a misunderstanding, which was quickly settled. Moreover, according to him, for the entire day of January 13, he had an ironclad alibi that completely ruled out the possibility of committing this terrible crime. Well, Nicky Joe's interrogation left more questions than answers. If it wasn't him, then who was it? Another version began to form in my head. What if the murder was committed by Robert Head, the man Nicky Whitehead was living with at the time of the tragedy? Perhaps he found out about her secret communication with another man and decided to brutally take revenge on his unfaithful cohabitant. However, the version about Robert Head's involvement in the murder was quickly dropped. During the investigation, it was established that the man worked as a long-distance trucker and on the day of the tragedy was on a business trip in another state. So purely physically, he could not have been present at the crime scene and committed this terrible act. And so the cops found themselves at a dead end again. On the one hand, there was the mutilated body of a victim who died a terrible death. On the other hand, there was a complete absence of suspects or leads that could put us on the trail of the killer. As an experienced detective, I understood that in such cases you need to act methodically and not miss a single detail. The first thing law enforcement did was thoroughly search the crime scene and collect all possible evidence from blood traces to fingerprints and microfibers. All these samples were sent to the laboratory for examination. While they were waiting for the analysis results, it was decided to delve deeper into the personal life of Nicky Whitehead. It was necessary to find out who the deceased communicated with, what places she visited, what she was passionate about. The detectives were especially interested in the last weeks and days before the murder. Perhaps that's where the key to this horrifying story was hidden. And then Mickey's daughters Jasmia and Tasmia came to mind. After all, who could know more about a woman's life than her own children? The girls were the closest people to their mother and could remember some details or events that would help track down the criminal. The police decided to take the sisters to the station and carefully question them there in a calm environment. Of course, the girls had just experienced a terrible tragedy and were in a state of shock. On the way to the station, one of the patrolmen noticed Tasmia's strange behavior. She kept biting her hands hard until they bled. Her sister Jasmia explained that for Tasmia, this is a usual way to cope with nervous tension, especially in stressful situations. Like now, after such a shock, this is a completely normal reaction. During the interrogation, the detective began to have a vague, alarming feeling. At first, he attributed it to professional intuition, which often helped in investigations, but over time this feeling only intensified. First, the detective found it extremely suspicious that Tasmia and Jasmia seemed to be crying, but at the same time there was no trace of tears on their faces. It seemed as if they were squeezing out this cry, playing to the audience, which was quite strange given the circumstances. Secondly, the detective could not help but notice how the girls spoke about their deceased mother. In their words, there were harsh, even offensive epithets about Nicky. You know, usually children who have just lost their parents remember them with special tenderness and even some idealization. But here everything was different. It seemed as if the girls were talking about some stranger, or even a person they hated. And this led to certain thoughts. The longer the interrogation lasted, the more the detective became convinced that the sisters were hiding something. Whether out of fear or for some other reasons, but their testimonies constantly had some kind of understatement and contradictions. And this made us think, what if they themselves were somehow involved in this horrific story? In the end, the team of investigators decided to separate the girls and interrogate each one individually. Of course, they began to resist, begging not to separate them, but the investigators were adamant. Although it's not very pleasant to separate sisters who have just experienced such a tragedy, the interests of the investigation required this step. By the way, another interesting nuance, Tasmia and Jasmia did not take off their gloves the whole time, even inside the police station. At first glance, it's a trifle, but in the context of the investigation, every detail can be important. So after completing the interrogation of Tasmia and Jasmia, the cops had a mixed impression. On the one hand, the girls seemed to be frank and admitted that lately their relationship with their mother had been, to put it mildly, strained. They even confessed that they sometimes thought about Nicky's death, but at the same time they insisted that they were not involved in the murder. On the other hand, it seemed that they were still hiding something. There were too many inconsistencies when comparing their testimonies obtained during separate interrogations. It's like putting together a puzzle, the pieces of which just won't fit together. And such a mismatch usually indicates a lie or concealment. Suspicions about the sisters only intensified after one incident. After the interrogation, the girls were sitting in the department room, hugging each other and seemingly crying. One of the employees, taking pity on them, approached and sympathetically asked if he could help them with something, do something for them. And then the unexpected happened. The sisters replied that they would like to watch TV. This moment just threw me off balance. Usually, children who have just lost their mother under such terrible circumstances are under such stress that TV is not even a question. But here, as if nothing had happened, life goes on as usual. Such a reaction seems somehow unnatural, and it only heightened the doubts of law enforcement officers. In the end, the investigators came to the conclusion that it was necessary to talk with the entourage of the Whitehead family, their friends, neighbors, acquaintances, to ask them about how Nikki's relationship with her daughters was, what were the nuances of their family life. And you know, the very first conversations opened their eyes to many things. It turned out that during the interrogation, the girls significantly smoothed out the severity of intrafamily conflicts, presenting everything as if there were problems, but not too serious ones. However, reality turned out to be much gloomier. To begin with, Nikki Whitehead herself was not born in the most favorable conditions. At the time of giving birth, her mother was serving a sentence in prison for distributing prohibited psychotropic substances, so the little one was taken care of by her grandmother Della Frazier. The woman felt very sorry for the girl, believed that she was already unlucky with the imprisoned mother, so from childhood she indulged all the whims of her granddaughter. When Nikki grew up, she repeatedly got involved with bad company and came to the attention of the police. Fortunately, somehow it did without serious consequences, but the fact remains the childhood and youth of the future victim were far from ideal. As for Della Frazier herself, after the detectives communicated with her, the impression was formed that this woman was excessively indulgent to the antics of her granddaughters. Perhaps she loved them in her own way, but she absolutely did not know how to keep them within the framework of discipline to resist their whims. So the girls got used to the fact that their grandmother allows and indulges everything. All this only emphasizes the unhealthy atmosphere in which the sisters grew up. As it turns out, at the age of 17, she gave birth to twins Tasmia and Jasmia. Almost nothing was known about the girls' father, only that shortly after their birth, he married another woman and moved to Canada, actually leaving the children to fend for themselves. According to eyewitnesses, despite her young age, Nikki sincerely rejoiced in motherhood and loved her daughters very much. But the trouble was that without a job and her own housing, the young mother was forced to give the little ones to her grandmother for upbringing, and she herself went to earn money. In fact, for several years she disappeared from the life of Tasmia and Jasmia, only rarely visiting them and sending money. But the immediate upbringing of the girls was carried out exclusively by the grandmother. Interestingly, despite such difficult circumstances, the sisters grew up to be very smart and diligent. According to teachers at school, they demonstrated remarkable success, were excellent students. In addition, they were engaged in art circles, participated in the Scout movement. And Della Frazier herself did not hide that she dreams of a brilliant future for her granddaughter's admission to prestigious universities, a decent career. It would seem that despite her daughter's early pregnancy and her irresponsibility, the woman managed to raise the girls properly. But as often happens, behind the screen of well-being, a completely different reality was hidden. After talking with family acquaintances, the investigators realized that Della made the same mistake that she once did with Nikki. She brought up her granddaughters in an atmosphere of permissiveness and indulgence of whims. That is, if at school the girls behaved flawlessly, then at home they did not listen to their grandmother at all, did not recognize any rules or restrictions, and the woman could do nothing about it. But the real problems began when Whitehead appeared in Nikki's life. Although the man was much older than her, Nikki sincerely fell in love with him and soon moved in with him. And then she decided to take her daughters to live with her, filing a corresponding lawsuit in court. And the court sided with her when the girls were 7 years old. They moved to their mother and her new cohabitant. It would seem that finally the children were reunited with their own mother. They had a full-fledged home. But not everything was so cloudless. Robert, who worked as a long-distance trucker, was often away. And while he was absent, the girls seemed to break loose. Accustomed to permissiveness at their grandmother's, now they took Nikki's attempts to discipline them, to teach them at least some rules with hostility. They openly rebelled against the routine established by their mother, although in fact it was quite reasonable lessons, limited time for walks, no gadgets before bed, and so on. But the girls were not going to put up with such oppression. According to neighbors, they tried in every possible way to circumvent their mother's prohibitions, and when she discovered disobedience, they quarreled with her through tantrums. It got to the point that Nikki began to take away phones from her daughters and forbid them to watch TV for their misdeeds. For girls who were used to freemen at their grandmother's, this was a real drama, and they openly declared that they were not going to endure it. So slowly, day by day, the conflict between mother and daughters only escalated. And I understood that this discord could result in something worse than just quarrels and tantrums. It remained only to guess how far could the girls go to finally throw off the maternal shackles. Be that as it may, Nikki Whitehead did not give up. Even at 25, having become the mother of 2 already adult girls, she tried to build the right model of life for them. Yes, sometimes it was not easy for her, and the methods were sometimes too harsh, but the woman sincerely strove to give her daughters what she herself did not receive at their age. Having obtained custody of the children, Nikki immediately established clear rules. Right after school lessons, time for walks and entertainment was strictly limited. At night, no phones or other gadgets. Complete obedience and submission to the mother. For any offense, punishment, from confiscation of equipment to a ban on watching TV. For girls who had lived for years in the permissiveness of their grandmother's upbringing, this came as a real culture shock. At some point, Robert Head, Nikki's cohabitant, witnessed one of these quarrels, and then a completely different relationship developed between him and the girls. When the man was at home, they behaved restrainedly, even a little afraid of him. But as soon as Robert left for another trip on a long-distance truck, the sisters seemed to break loose. Conflicts with their mother literally happened every day. The woman desperately tried to cope with her rebellious daughters, but where they're in her hands, they openly laughed at her attempts to educate them, to set some kind of framework. This daily struggle drained Nikki morally and physically. She was torn between work and the constant need to rein in her disobedient girls. But even then, the thought occurred to me, was this pedagogy limited only to moral pressure and strict punishments? Perhaps in the heat of another conflict, it even came to assault. At least some family acquaintances hinted that sometimes quarrels moved into a dangerous phase. But what really happened there behind closed doors remained only to guess. It would seem that after so many conflicts and even police intervention, the situation should have somehow improved. But no, the quarrels between Nikki and her daughters only escalated. Once, after another call, my colleagues again came to the Whitehead house, and they found a familiar picture there. A frightened Nikki claimed that her daughters had attacked her with their fists as soon as the door closed behind the police. However, something didn't add up in this story. When the cops went upstairs to the sisters' room, they unanimously assured that it was their mother who attacked them, not the other way around. Only the girls' words sounded extremely unconvincing. Unlike Nikki, whose hands were covered with fresh scratches and bruises, there was not a single abrasion on Tasmia and Jasmia, and this led to certain reflections. In the end, the girls were taken to the police station that day, and later a trial was held over them. Having weighed all the circumstances, the servants of Themis came to the conclusion that it would be better for the daughters to return to the care of their grandmother, and they should be temporarily isolated from Nikki. It was thought that Della Frazier would be able to curb her unruly granddaughters. But no, even this indulgent woman could not handle the sisters who had completely gotten out of hand. They openly neglected her authority, did everything their own way, regardless of comments or requests. And with age, their behavior became more and more aggressive. The girls repeatedly came to the attention of the police due to minor offenses and clashes. At the same time, Della continued to desperately make excuses for them, despite the obviousness of the problem. The woman sincerely loved her granddaughters and justified them in everything. But child protection specialist understood. The elderly Mrs. Frazier no longer has the strength and ability to raise 2 teenagers with such deviations. Someone was needed who could take the girls under strict but fair control. And then all eyes again turned to Nikki Whitehead. Despite all the complexity of her relationship with her daughters, she remained their mother and great hopes were pinned on her. So at the beginning of 2010, when the sisters turned 16, another court session took place. Its verdict was as follows. The girls must return to their mother for 2 weeks, a kind of probationary period. There were rumors that during this time, the supervisory authorities repeatedly visited Nikki's house to make sure that everything was okay, and allegedly there were no changes. The girls remained just as disobedient and problematic. However, the guardianship specialists stubbornly turned a blind eye to this. They hoped that during these 2 weeks, the daughters would somehow come to an understanding with their mother, find a common language. But as it turned out, Tasmia and Jasmia themselves were extremely dissatisfied with this decision. They unanimously declared that they did not want to live under the same roof with Nikki, that they preferred to stay with their grandmother. It seemed that the prospect of spending at least a few weeks with their own mother caused them almost panic fear. And in my opinion, such a reaction was very indicative. But no matter how much the girls protested, no one listened to them. Everyone around stubbornly believed that these 2 weeks would be fateful for the Whitehead sisters, that it was during this time that they would finally come to an understanding with their mother, begin a new life as a normal, healthy family. How could they have imagined then what a horrific surprise awaited them in the near future? And so, after long vicissitudes and disputes, Tasmia and Jasmia still found themselves in the house of their mother Nikki Whitehead and her cohabitant Robert Head. The girls had just turned 16 and they were to spend 2 fateful weeks with their mother, a kind of probationary period that was to determine their future life. But fate decreed otherwise. Just 8 days after the start of this experiment, the irreparable happened. Nikki was found dead in her own home. The woman became a victim of a brutal murder, the circumstances of which shocked even seasoned police officers. Since all the evidence against the Whitehead sisters was indirect and circumstantial, the girls had to be released. They returned to their adored grandmother and at first glance began to live their usual life, the same as they led before their mother took them to live with her for the last time. According to relatives and neighbors, the girls became simply inseparable. If before they spent a lot of time together anyway, now they did not leave each other for a single step at all, as if they were afraid of getting lost or losing that invisible but strong sisterly bond. But the change in their behavior was most striking. If before the tragedy Tasmia and Jasmia were rather noisy and problematic girls, now they behaved quietly and calmly. Against the backdrop of accusations and gossip that rained down on them after their mother's death, the sisters seemed to be trying to become as inconspicuous as possible. At school, they almost stopped communicating with their peers. Immediately after classes, they hurried home. It seemed that the girls deliberately avoided any contact with the outside world, as if fearing unwanted attention to their persons. Meanwhile, the investigation into the murder of Nikki Whitehead was delayed for many months. The investigation carefully collected and checked all possible evidence, interviewed witnesses, put forward versions. But despite all efforts, the case did not budge for a long time. It seemed as if the criminal had not left a single trace, a single clue that could be grasped. And so in May, the results of the examinations of the evidence collected at the crime scene finally came. For me, they did not become some kind of revelation, rather. They only confirmed those suspicions that arose immediately after acquaintance with the case. First, the bite marks on the hands of Tasmia and Jasmia perfectly matched the dental impressions of their murdered mother. Remember the episode when Tasmia suddenly began to bite her hand in the police car as if from severe stress? As it turned out, she did it not at all because of nervous tension. It was a desperate but extremely stupid way to mask the traces of her mother's teeth on her skin. Secondly, 2 boxes with their shoes were found in the sisters' room, on which traces of Nikki Whitehead's blood were clearly visible. And also that missing stack of towels from the bathroom, which I mentioned earlier. It was found stuffed into the washing machine, soaked in blood not only of the victim, but also of the twins themselves. These and other facts eloquently testified that it was not some mysterious malefactors who were involved in Nikki's death, but 2 people dear to her, Tasmia and Jasmia. Teenagers whom she so desperately tried to curb and put on the true path. Her own daughters. The only question that remained somewhat vague was the distribution of the sisters' roles in the commission of the crime. DNA examination was powerless to determine to which of the twins certain biological traces belonged. However, I had practically no doubt that the girls acted together and deliberately. The murder of the mother was not some tragic coincidence. It was planned and implemented as a well-organized and thought-out crime. Of course, the young age and the stunning cruelty of the deed could raise doubts. Are these delicate 16-year-old creatures really capable of such brutality? But unfortunately, my many years of practice show that anyone is capable of murder. And if a person has already decided to cross the line of law and morality, age and gender do not play the main role at all. Additional confirmation of this version was the video recording from the surveillance cameras of the school where the girls studied. It clearly shows how on the day of the murder, January 13, Tasmia and Jasmia enter the educational institution together at 10:17 in the morning. That is, in fact, they are late for half of the lessons. This raised a lot of questions. After all, if everything was as the sisters told at first, they should have left the house at 7:30 and, in the worst case, been late for some half an hour. Instead, we see the absence of girls in several classes in a row, and this leads to certain reflections. What were they doing all this time? Where were they and what were they doing instead of sitting at their desks? Of course, at first the thought arose that Tasmia and Jasmia could simply skip classes like many other teenagers. But in the context of all the circumstances, this version looked unlikely. Unfortunately, it looked much more like the girls spent the morning hours implementing their horrific plan. Realizing the seriousness of the suspicions and the evidence collected, on May 21, our group went to the Whitehead sister school. Right on the territory of the educational institution, in front of the stunned students and teachers, the detention of Tasmia and Jasmia took place. The girls were placed in an official car to be taken to the police station for further investigative actions.
And here we witnessed a striking change in the behavior of the sisters. If earlier they pretended to be frightened and confused victims of circumstances, now they seemed to have dropped their masks. In the police car, the girls began to behave defiantly, even aggressively. They unanimously declared their non-involvement in the crime, accusing the cops of deliberately appointing them guilty in order to close the high-profile case as soon as possible. Even being in the police station, in the interrogation room, the sisters stubbornly refused to admit their guilt. It seemed that neither the iron evidence nor the psychological pressure was able to break through this wall of defiant silence. Tasmia and Jasmia sat side by side, tightly pursing their lips and looking at one point. In their eyes, one could read not only fright, but also some strange determination like that of people who have already made a fateful decision. Looking back, I think it was at that moment that we all finally saw the true face of the Whitehead sisters. Not frightened children, not victims of circumstances, but two young individuals capable of a brutal and insidious crime. Cold-blooded, prudent murderers despite their 16 years. On July 12, after a thorough study of all the evidence and circumstances of the case, Tasmia and Jasmia were officially charged for the premeditated murder of their mother, Nikki. The girls were taken into custody before the trial. Without the right to bail, the charges against them were too serious. But the most interesting thing happened a little later. Realizing that the weight of evidence against them was irrefutable, the sisters suddenly decided to confess, and what they told during the next interrogation made even us, seasoned police officers, shudder. According to the girls, when their stepfather Robert was away, Nikki often drank. Moreover, she did it not like a normal person who wants to relax with a glass of wine, but abused it in a big way. Tasmia and Jasmia even suggested that sometimes their mother indulged in illegal substances, so inadequate was her behavior at such moments. With tears in their eyes, the sisters told how their drunken mother picked on them for any reason, provoked scandals out of the blue, and also that even when sober, Mickey was very cold and detached with them. The girls did not see any warmth or maternal love from her. Furthermore, on the eve of the tragedy, another drunken quarrel occurred. Nikki, pretty tipsy, began to yell at her daughters, calling them names. The scandal lasted almost until the morning, and only in the morning, tired, they all fell asleep. But they were not destined to rest. Just a few hours later, Nikki again burst into the girls' room and began to wake them up. They say it's time for school. At the same time, she carelessly poked them with a spoon and mumbled something about studying and responsibilities. And when the sisters went down to the kitchen to have breakfast, another conflict broke out over nothing. Then the sisters told quite terrible things about how they, unable to withstand the bullying, attacked their mother with a knife, how they dealt blow after blow until she fell dead, how they dragged the bloody body to the bathroom to somehow cover their tracks, how they washed the floor with towels but still could not remove all the blood. And after this horrific cleaning, the girls simply changed clothes, hid their shoes with traces of blood away, and, as if nothing had happened, went to school. When asked why they did not immediately tell the truth, the sisters did not give a clear answer. They only shrugged their shoulders and looked away. At the trial, Tasmia and Jasmia fully admitted their guilt. Without unnecessary emotions or attempts to justify themselves, they simply confirmed everything that they said during the interrogations. For the premeditated murder of their mother, the Whitehead sisters were sentenced to 30 years in prison. Their lawyer stated that such a sentence gives the girls hope for the future. They say, if they had not admitted guilt, the term could have been much tougher. Interestingly, even after being behind bars, the sisters managed to finish their schooling. Their grandmother, Della Frazier, was present even at the graduation. Despite all the horror of what her granddaughters did, the old woman continues to love and support them. An amazing woman, in my opinion. In 2017, Tasmia and Jasmia filed a petition for parole, but fortunately they were denied. If they do not receive more parole, they will be released only in 2044 when both will already be 47. I hope that during this time they will realize the full weight of their crime and repent. Although, to be honest, it's hard to believe in it. This is such a terrible and eerie story, friends. A story about how hatred and cruelty can poison even the closest people. About how important it is to notice the alarming signs in time and react to them. And that nothing in this world justifies such a brutal crime, not even teenage maximalism or difficult family relationships.
This is Travis, a young man born on July 28, 1977 in sunny California, was a sales department employee. His parents were Horror-David and Lisa Butt Morgan, an ordinary American family. One September day in 26, fate brought Travis together with an aspiring photographer, a 26-year-old blonde named Jodi Arias. It happened at a professional conference in vibrant Las Vegas, dedicated to prepaid and legal services, where Travis was representing his company. Jodi Arias, despite her young age, was already actively seeking opportunities to collaborate with a company where Travis worked. Their acquaintance happened spontaneously, but from the first minutes there was an incredible chemistry between them. They communicated perfectly, as if they had known each other all their lives, and seemed to have a lot in common. Wanting to continue their communication in a more private setting, Travis invited Jodi to his company's official dinner as his personal guest. It was there, amidst business conversations and glasses of wine, that a spark ignited between them, which later grew into a passionate romance. Jodi was enchanted by Travis's sense of humor, ease, and cheerful disposition. Next to him, she felt comfortable and carefree, forgetting about all her troubles. Their meetings became regular, filled with laughter, passion, and dreams of a shared future. As an experienced detective, I would note that often it is precisely such seemingly perfect acquaintances that can lead to unpredictable and even tragic consequences. Behind the mask of attractiveness and friendliness, dark secrets and dangerous intentions can hide. However, at that moment, nothing foreshadowed trouble. The lovers enjoyed each other's company, making plans for the future and not suspecting what a dramatic turn their relationship would take. From the outside, it seemed that Travis and Jodi were a perfect couple, created by fate itself. They complemented each other, shared common interests and dreams. However, as practice shows, often behind the ideal facade, deep cracks hide that can destroy even the strongest relationships. And this case was no exception. After that fateful acquaintance at the conference, Jodi decided to end her relationship with her then boyfriend and dive headfirst into a romance with Travis. However, distance stood in the way of their happiness. The lovers lived in different states. Travis lived in another region, while Jodi remained in Palm Desert, California. But this did not become an obstacle to their feelings, and they continued to keep in touch despite the geographical remoteness. According to one of Travis' friends, Jodi made the impression of a very attractive and friendly girl. Her long blonde hair and slender figure could not leave any man indifferent. During a joint dinner with Travis, they constantly talked about something, and from the outside, it seemed that a genuine mutual affection had arisen between them. Travis and Jodi's relationship developed rapidly, despite the distance. They constantly communicated by phone, exchanged messages, and tried to see each other in person as often as possible. It seemed that nothing could overshadow their happiness. However, I would note that not all of Travis' friends shared his admiration for the new girl. Some of them, who had the chance to get to know Jodi better and observe the development of their relationship, felt a certain uneasiness. Perhaps it was some kind of sixth sense that hinted that something disturbing was hiding behind Jodi's attractive appearance and sweet smile. But lovers rarely listen to the advice of friends, especially when it comes to matters of the heart. Travis was so enchanted by Jodi that he did not pay attention to the warnings of those around him. He was convinced that he had found his true love and was ready to fight for this relationship no matter what. As practice shows, often at the beginning of a romance, during the so-called rose-colored glasses period, lovers do not notice obvious alarming signs in the behavior of their other half. They idealize their partner, attributing desired qualities to them and ignoring potential flaws. And only with time, when the euphoria subsides and the relationship reaches a new level, true faces and intentions begin to reveal themselves. But despite all the warnings, Travis and Jodi continued to enjoy their romance. They made plans for the future, dreamed of a life together, and were ready to overcome any obstacles on the way to their happiness. However, as time will tell, sometimes the greatest danger lurks from those we love the most. And right now, the crack in the relationship that I will tell you about will happen. The more people hear this story, the more people can draw conclusions for themselves and protect themselves from similar circumstances. This is very important. Despite the passionate feelings and plans for a shared future, after 5 months, Jodi and Travis' relationship reached a dead end. They decided to break up, but as often happens in such cases, they could not completely sever the connection. The former lovers continued to maintain physical intimacy and communicate as if nothing had changed. At first, it seemed that such a format of the relationship suited them perfectly. They remained a part of each other's lives, but without burdensome obligations and promises. But everything changed when Travis started dating another woman. The news of her ex-boyfriend's new passion came as a real blow to Jodi. She could not come to terms with the thought that Travis now belonged to another. Jealousy clouded her mind, pushing her to reckless actions. Jodi began to obsessively follow Travis' life on social media. She hacked his accounts, read private correspondence, trying to find even the slightest hint of his new relationship. It became a kind of obsession for her, absorbing all her thoughts and actions. Once Travis, seemingly jokingly but with a note of anxiety, said to his friend, "Don't be surprised if one day you find me dead." Perhaps deep down, he already felt that Jody's obsession could have fatal consequences. I can say that such jokes are often a kind of cry for help. People who find themselves in toxic and dangerous relationships sometimes unconsciously send signals to others, hoping that someone will intervene and save them from the threat. But at that moment, neither Travis himself nor his friends gave proper significance to this joke. They attributed it to Jody's eccentricity and did not perceive her behavior as a real danger. Months passed and Jody's obsession only intensified. She gave Travis no peace, stalked him, threw tantrums and caused scandals. Eventually, at the end of May 2008, tired of her endless antics, Travis gave Jody an ultimatum. Either she leaves his life forever or he will be forced to take radical measures. But was Jody ready to let go of her obsession so easily? Could she come to terms with the idea that Travis would never belong to her again? The answers to these questions will sound right now because at that point, all the alarm bells were ringing at full force, foreshadowing the tragic denouement of this story. At the beginning of 2008, Travis had grand plans. He organized a business trip to Mexico, which was to take place on June 15th. And interestingly, he initially planned this trip together with Jody. It would seem to be an ideal opportunity for lovers to spend time together, combining work and leisure under the scorching Mexican sun. But in April, the situation changed dramatically. Travis suddenly informed Jody that the plans had changed, and instead of her, he had decided to take another girl with him. We can only imagine what a blow this was for Jody, who had already managed to paint a perfect picture of their joint trip in her imagination. And so, the night of June 2nd arrived. Around 2 o'clock, Jody, unable to bear the tension, began calling Travis. She dialed his number 4 times in a row, but he stubbornly did not answer. Perhaps he already felt then that a conversation with Jody would not bring anything good and tried to avoid conflict. The longest call lasted only 17 seconds. Imagine this picture. Jody engulfed in jealousy and anger, pressing the call button again and again, and Travis, tired of her intrusiveness, simply looking at the phone screen, not daring to answer. But Jody did not give up. She kept calling, and eventually Travis couldn't stand it. He answered her call, and they talked for 18 minutes at first, and then for another 41 minutes. One can only guess what they were talking about and how tense this conversation was. The last conversation between them lasted 2 minutes and 48 seconds. What was said in those nearly 3 minutes? Did Jody try to convince Travis to change his plans one last time? Or maybe she was already threatening him with reprisals. Unfortunately, we will never know for sure. I have seen many similar cases. When one person obsessively pursues another, giving them no peace day or night, it can drive even the most resilient personality to despair. And unfortunately, such situations often end in tragedy. So we have every reason to assume that these nightly calls from Jody became a kind of point of no return in her relationship with Travis. She could not come to terms with his decision to take another girl with him on the trip and was ready to do anything to hinder these plans. And Travis, in turn, was already tired of her constant tantrums and scandals and sought to break this toxic bond as soon as possible. After that fateful phone conversation with Travis, Jody decided to act. She rented a car, intending to make a long trip to the state of Utah. At first, her path led through Southern California, where she visited her friends at a work conference. It would seem to be an ordinary stop along the way, but as it turned out later, it had far-reaching consequences. During her stay in California, Jody met with Ryan Burns, Travis' colleague, and it was from him that we learned several interesting details. It turns out that at the time of the meeting with Burns, Jody's blonde hair had already been dyed dark chestnut. Moreover, Burns noticed cuts on her hands. A strange change of image and injuries, don't you think? It seems that Jody was preparing for something important and tried to disguise her appearance. On June 6th, Jody left California for Utah, stopping by the city of Alta along the way. All this time, she tried to contact Travis, leaving him numerous voice messages. Her obsession reached such a level that she even managed to gain access to the voicemail system of his mobile phone. One can only guess what words she left in those messages and whether they contained threats against Travis. When returning the rented car, Jody had to explain a few strange things. First, according to the seller, the car managed to accumulate about 3,000 miles in a short period of time. Second, the rental clerk noticed the absence of floor mats in the cabin and the presence of suspicious red stains on the seats. However, unfortunately, these stains were never thoroughly investigated, as the company rushed to clean the car before the police examined it. As an experienced detective, I cannot help but note that all these details raise serious suspicions. Why did Jody need to change her appearance so drastically? Why were there cuts on her hands? And most importantly, what were the mysterious red stains found in the car she rented? All these questions suggest that something sinister is hiding behind Jody's outward decency. Of course, at that moment, no one could have predicted what tragic events this seemingly ordinary trip would lead to. But from the height of the years lived and taking into account all the circumstances of the case, we can say with confidence that it was during that period that Jody embarked on a dark path from which there was no turning back. So let's set aside these alarming details for now and move a few days forward, when Travis' friends sounded the alarm, unable to contact him. It was their persistence and concern that led to the terrible discovery that forever changed the course of this story. On June 9th, Travis' friends sounded the alarm. They had not been able to contact him for several days, which was extremely unusual for such a communicative person. Even his roommates had not seen Travis during this time, simply thinking that he had gone somewhere on business. But the friends' concern grew with each passing hour, and they decided to visit his home to check if everything was all right. What they saw upon entering Travis' apartment was forever etched in their memory. There was a huge pool of blood on the floor, and Travis' body itself lay in the shower. It is hard to even imagine the shock and horror that gripped his friends at that moment. Without wasting a second, they called 911, summoning emergency services. The dispatcher, taking the call, asked standard questions. One of them concerned whether Travis was prone to suicide. Of course, his friends rejected such a possibility. They knew Travis as a cheerful and positive person who would never take such a step. Another question was more alarming. Was there anyone from Travis' circle who might wish him harm? And then Travis' friends remembered Jody Arias, Travis' ex-girlfriend. They said that she literally stalked him, was wildly jealous, and even resorted to such extremes as hacking his Facebook page and damaging the tires of his car. It seemed that Jody was obsessed with Travis and could not come to terms with the fact that he had left her. As a detective with many years of experience, I immediately realized that this information could be key to the investigation. Obsession and aggressive behavior of former partners often lead to tragic consequences. And although at that moment it was still too early to draw final conclusions, Jody Arias automatically fell into the list of main suspects. Of course, investigators could not rule out other versions. Perhaps Travis had some enemies that even his closest friends did not know about. Or it could have been an ordinary robbery gone wrong. But with each new detail, with each new fact that surfaced during the investigation, the arrow of suspicion increasingly pointed towards Jody. Now the cops needed to act quickly and in a coordinated manner. Interrogate all possible witnesses, gather evidence, track the movements of suspects. Every minute was worth its weight in gold because the killer was still at large and could strike again at any moment. When the detectives arrived at the crime scene and began a thorough search of Travis' apartment, one of the first finds made us shudder. A camera was found in the washing machine. At first glance, nothing strange nowadays. Many people have digital cameras. But during further investigation, it turned out that this camera had been purchased quite recently. And most importantly, it was damaged. Such details immediately made us wary. Later, technical experts set about restoring the data from the camera, and what they found came as a real shock. In the recovered images, we saw Jody Arias and Travis in rather intimate poses. The pictures were dated June 4th around 2 p.m. It turns out that on that day, Jody was in Travis' apartment, and more than just a friendly meeting was taking place between them. But the most shocking thing was that the camera contained photographs of Travis immediately before the murder, during it, and even after. It was like some kind of eerie photo report taken by the killer himself. The last photo in which Travis was still alive was taken at 5:29 p.m. on the same day, and literally a few minutes later, the camera captured bloody scenes in his bathroom. In these terrible pictures, one could make out the silhouette of a person, probably Travis, lying on the floor in a pool of his own blood. The red liquid spread across the floor, creating eerie patterns, and on the wall of the corridor leading to the bathroom, a bloody handprint was clearly visible. Later, the examination showed that the print contained mixed DNA of both Jody and Travis. In fact, investigators obtained irrefutable evidence that Jody Arias was present at the crime scene at the time of Travis' murder. Her intimate photos with the victim and taken just a few hours before his death, as well as her handprints at the crime scene, all this spoke in favor of the fact that she was the main suspect. It was necessary to carefully analyze each photograph, each detail in order to reconstruct an accurate picture of the events of that fatal day. But even then, we felt that we had taken a huge step towards solving this horrific crime. Now law enforcement had not just the testimony of friends about Jodi's obsession and aggressive behavior. In their hands were photographs that irrefutably proved her involvement in the murder, and although there was still a lot of work ahead of us, we were filled with determination to see the case through to the end and bring the perpetrators to justice. Only one question remained: why? What could have pushed a young woman to commit such a terrible crime? Love, jealousy, hatred. Or maybe there was something more behind this, something we did not yet understand. Believe me, what happened next just shocked me. July 15, 2008 became a decisive day in this case. It was then, based on the evidence gathered, that Jodi Arias was arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder. What happened next can boldly be called a theater of the absurd. At first, Jodi completely denied her presence in the city on the day of the crime. She claimed that the last time she saw Travis was back in March of that year. Imagine the shock we felt upon hearing such outright lies. After all, we had irrefutable evidence in our hands that it was on June 4th that Jodi was in Travis' apartment, and not just there, but had an intimate relationship with him. But the most impressive thing was that Jodi managed to stick to this false version for a whole 2 years. Only after such a long time, realizing perhaps that her position did not stand up to any criticism, she suddenly changed her testimony. Now she claimed that she was indeed in Travis' apartment on the night of the murder, but only because he himself had called her. Eventually, in March 2013, after long weeks of trial, Jodi Arias was found guilty of premeditated first-degree murder. The jury could not come to a unanimous decision on the death penalty, so Jodi was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But even behind bars, this woman continued to amaze with her behavior. During interrogations, she could suddenly start singing, laughing, talking to herself, or even doing a handstand. It was so strange and inappropriate that even seasoned guards could not contain their surprise. But perhaps the most shocking thing for me was the fact that Jodi attended Travis' memorial service. She came there, although she knew for sure that everyone suspected her of this terrible murder. And the whole time, while Travis' friends and relatives were mourning his death, Jodi sat with a stone face. She did not shed a single tear, did not show any sympathy. It seemed that she was not at all worried about the grief of other people. Now Jodi Arias is serving her sentence in the Arizona State Prison Complex. And even there, she manages to be in the spotlight. Recently, in one interview, she said that she receives a lot of love from fans behind bars. "There is so much love in my direction that I can't even respond to it now," she said with a smile. In April 2019, Jodi filed an appeal against her sentence, claiming that she did not receive a fair trial. But on March 24, 2020, the Arizona Court of Appeals upheld the verdict without changes. Thus ended one of the loudest and most scandalous criminal cases in US history. Do you remember your first love, the school crush? Do you remember sitting there, thinking about the object of your affection, feeling emotions you had never known before, the inspiration you didn't know existed? Then surely you also remember the first time your heart was broken, shattered dreams due to a betrayal in life. Our first romantic experience undoubtedly shapes and has a tremendous impact on any teenager. Most of us quickly recover even after the worst breakup. But what if your first love, which allowed you to taste the sweetness of life like never before, ultimately destroyed you? Spring 2011. Summerfield, a quiet little town in central Florida. For teenagers living here, it was perhaps too quiet. The town had 2 stores, a movie theater, and a skate park, but mostly it was just fields, fields, and more fields. In other words, local kids had nothing to occupy themselves with and could easily get into trouble if they didn't surround themselves with kids from decent families. Local boy Seth Jackson was a handsome and popular 15-year-old student, quite tall for his age. He and his best friend, William Samuelat, enjoyed riding bikes, skateboarding, and were passionate about martial arts. Seth was an excellent student and dreamed of pursuing a professional career in wrestling after turning 18, and his future looked very promising. On Monday, April 11th, the students of Summerfield gathered at their desks after the weekend and quickly noticed that their friend Seth was absent. William and Seth had planned to meet up after classes, and William sent him several messages that went unanswered. Seth didn't respond to his persistent calls either. The prolonged silence from his friend surprised William, and finally, he decided to call Seth's mother. As it turned out,
Seth's parents assumed that he had spent the night at William's house. Concerned, they contacted the police. The police didn't rush to sound the alarm about the 15-year-old teenager, but officers came to talk to his parents. Seth's mother mentioned that the last time she had been in contact with him was at 9:15 p.m. She asked if he needed a ride home, to which he responded sharply and rudely. It was extremely unusual for him to speak to his mother that way, as he had never done so before. He texted that he wouldn't be staying at home and would spend the night with friends. Sonia didn't know what had upset her son so much. However, she attributed it to teenage mood swings and decided not to argue over the phone but to talk to him when he returned home. The abrupt messages only confirmed the officers' suspicions that Seth had simply run away from home and would soon return. But they had to make sure, and to find the boy, they needed to understand what had been happening in his life recently. The parents gave the police permission to examine their son's phone records. They also provided the detectives with a list of Seth's friends, mentioning that he had broken up with a girl a few weeks ago and probably hadn't fully recovered from the breakup. She might know something. The girl's name is Amber Wright. Her 16-year-old brother, Kyle, is also an old friend of Seth's, so it was definitely worth talking to these kids. That's where the detectives headed next, to their house. They explained to Amber, who opened the door, the reason for their visit and asked if she knew where Seth might be. As it turned out, she had seen him the previous evening. They chatted a bit when Seth started arguing with his mother on the phone, and then he went home. Charlie Lee, Amber's friend, was with them. 18-year-old Charlie was married and rented out rooms in her house because her husband ended up in prison and she needed to support herself somehow. Since she had had a falling out with her family over her husband, whom they didn't like, she must have felt lonely, and she quickly became friends with Amber. As Charlie was present during the conversation, the detectives needed to interview the two witnesses separately. They decided to talk to the girls individually. During the conversation, Charlie reiterated Amber's story but added one unexpected detail. Seth was texting with his mother when suddenly he heard a loud sound resembling a gunshot. Charlie stated that she didn't know what the source of the sound was, but Seth suddenly started running down the road. This was a shocking revelation, as if it truly was a gunshot. Could Seth have been running to save his life? Especially since, at some distance from them, the girl saw a person who could have been shooting at Seth. She wasn't sure if he was armed, but she believed it was Michael Bargo, Amber's new boyfriend. Michael was 18 years old and rented a room from Charlie, which is how he met Amber. When the officers spoke to Amber again, she denied everything her friend had said. It was clear that one of the girls was lying. The only thing their testimonies coincided on was that both of them saw the boy the previous evening and didn't know where he was now or where the police could find Michael Bargo. But it wasn't just the police who were looking for Seth. William went to talk to Amber, where he encountered detectives coming out of her house. They asked him when he had last seen his friend. Unexpectedly, William also stated that he was with Seth yesterday. They were hanging out at a mutual friend's house with a small group of guys, playing video games and having a great time when Seth received a message and went to talk on the phone. It was Amber. William overheard part of the conversation. The girl assured Seth that she wanted to reconcile with him and asked for a meeting. Despite their breakup, Seth still loved her and couldn't get her out of his head. William asked him not to meet with Amber but wasn't sure if he would listen. That was the last time William saw his friend. The police heard 3 different versions of what happened the previous evening from Amber, Charlie, and William. But William's concern deeply affected the detectives. They were no longer certain that the boy had simply run away. Additionally, they found it strange that Amber didn't mention her phone call to Seth. The search for the boy continued. The detectives still hadn't been able to talk to 2 members of the group, Kyle and Michael Bargo. Michael was an 18-year-old guy who had graduated from school but preferred to surround himself with younger students, among whom he felt more confident. Checking Bargo's records, the detectives discovered that he had previous encounters with the police and had been found in possession of weapons.
Furthermore, he had a court order prohibiting him from approaching another teenager. The police became more eager to speak with him. William, continuing his own investigation, returned to Amber's house. They used to be friends, but when Amber broke up with his best friend, William no longer trusted her. He demanded to know where his friend was. Amber initially resisted, but when he insisted that she not lie to him, she said, "William, there are things you don't need to know," and asked him to leave. This did not appease him at all. He was now certain that his friend's disappearance was somehow related to his breakup with Amber, but he didn't know the details. The pieces of this puzzle refused to come together. Luckily, teenagers always leave a digital trail, and the most important clues that helped reconstruct the details of Seth's disappearance were indeed digital. Seth used to spend a lot of time online, and his social media profiles contained a lot of personal information. Seth and Amber started dating in December 2010. Things escalated quickly, and their relationship was constantly on display for everyone to see on social media. But it didn't last long. Suddenly, after 3 months of intense dating, Amber abruptly broke up with Seth without giving him any explanation. Seth was deeply hurt, feeling both pain and resentment. However, his hurt turned into anger when he found out that Amber quickly found a replacement and started dating Michael Bargo. He felt betrayed by her and started an online war on Facebook, which was witnessed by all of their acquaintances. Insults were exchanged, and at some point, Michael and Amber's brother, Kyle, joined in the conversation. Amber, visibly upset by how Seth was talking about her online, told Kyle and Michael that Seth had humiliated her. It was clear that nobody would come out as a winner in this feud. But in late March, what was once an online rivalry escalated into a real-life confrontation. Seth learned that Amber had attended a party with Bargo and headed there himself. He not only had no fear of Bargo, but also knocked him down with a single blow. For Bargo, it was a severe blow to his reputation to be defeated by a 15-year-old boy in front of all his friends, and he vowed to seek revenge on Seth. Even Seth's mother personally heard Michael tell her son that he had a bullet with Seth's name on it. The detectives wondered if the boy could have snapped because of this entire situation and run away from town. William searched for his friend relentlessly but couldn't find any leads. The police also made no progress until the next morning. On Tuesday morning, the police received a phone call that completely changed the course of the case. The detectives hadn't spoken to the woman who called before, but they were familiar with her last name. It was Amber and Kyle's mother. She seemed distraught and asked the police to speak with her son. During the interrogation at the police station, it became evident that Kyle was deeply traumatized by some event. He couldn't calm down, held his head in his hands, stuttered, and couldn't begin his account. Finally, he confirmed the worst fears of the police. He revealed that on the night of Seth's disappearance, he was at Charlie Lee's house along with Seth, Charlie, Michael Bargo, Amber, and Justin Soto, another tenant in the house. When Seth arrived at the house, Michael Bargo unexpectedly killed him. After speaking with Kyle, the detectives interviewed Amber. The girl quickly composed herself and explained that she was too scared during her initial conversation with the police. She did everything she could to appear as innocent as possible in the events that transpired. Charlie, just like Kyle and Amber, also blamed Bargo for everything. The police continued their search for the suspected killer. However, the detectives believed that they were not being told the whole truth. After individually questioning the teenagers, they were all brought into a shared room and left alone. Although they should have known that the police could have cameras and microphones anywhere, the suspects seemed to forget about it every time. The teens started talking. It turned out that each of them played a role in Seth's murder. However, it was evident that they didn't fully comprehend the gravity of their actions or the consequences that would follow. They were concerned about the story making headlines and people hating them. At one point, Amber complained that when she gets out of jail, she'll be 20 years old. It was a rather arrogant statement. 5 years for a heinous first-degree murder. During the following days, the investigators would scrutinize the teenagers' social media accounts and examine the data from their phones, uncovering truly horrifying details of Seth's final hours of life. It was evident that Michael Bargo was the one who had the idea to kill Seth. He shared this idea with Amber, who instead of dissuading him, agreed to it. She was angry with Seth and, in a way, had set up the stage for this scene herself. Thus, her role was to lure Seth into the trap and warn the other three waiting inside with a message. When Seth entered the house, Justin Soto was supposed to attack him from the front, while Kyle and Michael Bargo would approach from behind and beat him. After enjoying the beating, because that was precisely their plan, to derive pleasure from beating the boy, they intended to kill him. Bargo wanted Seth to remain conscious until the end, to know who had fired the fatal shot. It was a meticulously planned crime. On Sunday evening around 7 p.m., Amber contacted Seth and asked to meet up, explaining that she wanted to reconcile and start dating him again. Seth, who still loved Amber, was overjoyed by her messages. However, he found her sudden change in mood suspicious and asked her if she was planning to set him up for revenge by her boyfriend. Of course, she denied such intentions, claiming she would never do that to him. Seth had reasons to suspect Amber's deceit. A few weeks earlier, Michael and Kyle had proposed a meeting to Seth and William to resolve their differences. The boys agreed, but when they were nearing the meeting spot, they heard a gunshot and naturally turned back. It was later revealed that Kyle had fired the shot. It seemed that he wanted to make Seth and William understand that they were armed and perhaps wanted to avoid a fight. Nonetheless, Seth chose to ignore his instincts and agreed to meet Amber because he still loved her. After bidding William goodbye, he headed to the meeting place at around 9 p.m. The trap was set. However, something didn't go according to plan at first. Seth met Amber and Charlie at the designated spot, and the girls convinced him to go to Charlie's house. As they approached the house with Seth, Amber intentionally or unintentionally failed to inform her accomplices that they were already close. When Seth calmly entered the house, Justin didn't immediately attack him. Perhaps he still hoped it was all a failed prank. Unaware of the impending danger, Seth calmly sat in the room, preparing to hear what Amber allegedly wanted to say to him. Suddenly, Kyle burst in from behind and struck Seth on the head with a wooden axe handle, while Bargo shot him twice in the back. However, Seth managed to open the door and escape outside. This is where Justin, who initially refrained from attacking Seth, intervened. He stopped Seth, and the three of them dragged the wounded teenager back into the house. Astonishingly, Charlie Lee, their neighbor, witnessed the events but dismissed them as a teenage fight. Meanwhile, the teenagers placed Seth in the bathtub and left him alone with Michael Bargo. If only he had called the police. While the others took cleaning supplies and washed the house, Bargo cruelly tormented him for hours, beating and even shooting him. Fully satisfied with his vengeance, he shot directly into the teenager's handsome face. He wanted to take from him what he himself didn't have. It was an execution. Michael wanted the victim to experience pain, humiliation, and fear. It's difficult to imagine what was going on in Seth's mind at that moment, the agony he endured in the last hours of his life. At some point, Kyle entered the bathroom and pleaded with Bargo to stop, not out of sudden remorse but because he feared that the neighbors would hear the noise and call the police. However, for Seth, it was all over. Now, the killers had a body they needed to get rid of. They had a sleeping bag ready. Seth was quite tall, so they broke his kneecaps and tied him to fit inside it. The criminals had already lit a bonfire. They threw the boy into the fire. The flames were so powerful that neighbors came twice to check on the teenagers if everything was all right. But it didn't scare them. On the contrary, if planning a brutal murder, carrying it out, and deciding to burn a human body weren't enough, now they had a party around the bonfire, playing music, dancing, and drinking. Apparently, the smell that should have come from the fire didn't bother them at all.
And when everyone went to sleep, Kyle kept the fire going until 2:30 in the morning and calmly went to work the next day. But there's still more horrifying details in this case. In the morning, James Haven, Amber, and Kyle's stepfather came to help the guys get rid of the boys' remains. They placed what was left of Seth in containers and took them to a quarry where they threw them into the water. It turns out that the 37-year-old man was aware of the teenagers' plan all along because he had been hanging out with them the previous evening. However, when they started discussing the fate of Seth, he felt uncomfortable and left. When the police obtained a warrant and searched the crime scene, forensic experts found bones and the weapon in the fire. The rest was retrieved from the water in the nearby quarry. They eventually found Michael Bargo at his friend and her parents' house. After the boys' sudden disappearance, the whole town was on edge and Bargo decided to flee the city. But he didn't go into hiding, as one might assume. Haven drove Bargo to his girlfriend, to whom he immediately confessed everything. He then confessed about the murder to her father, his girlfriend, and even his son. He even admitted to one of the family's neighbors. When he was arrested on April 19th, he immediately spilled all the details to his cellmates, and one of them promptly told the police. He couldn't keep his mouth shut. Perhaps he truly didn't grasp the seriousness of the crime because, as it turned out, he suffered from a range of mental issues. Maybe with timely intervention, all of this could have been avoided. Due to the incredible cruelty of the crime, all the teenagers were tried as adults. They were all sentenced to life in prison. James Haven was tried as an accomplice. At the trial, Michael Bargo tried to claim that he didn't kill anyone and that he was just at Charlie's house. He stated that someone else among the teenagers likely committed the murder. He even claimed that Amber was never his girlfriend. However, the jury didn't believe him. They deliberated for only 4 hours. Since he showed no mercy to his victim, they followed his example and sentenced him to the death penalty. Bargo became the youngest person on death row in Florida. The convicts tried to appeal, but it was only successful in Charlie's case. She was released in 2019. Despite the fact that it was Bargo who fired the bullet that killed Seth Jackson, many can't shake the thought of the role Amber truly played. If not for her manipulations, Seth would be alive today. By accusing her ex-boyfriend of being rude to her, she loaded the weapon that ultimately fired. However, regardless of who was the mastermind of the crime, the fact remains it was a cruel, senseless, and heartless murder committed by a group of heartless teenagers. Carrie Swenson probably learned to ski before she could walk, but she could never have imagined that biathlon would become her life because for women, this sport simply didn't exist before. Finally, in 1983, women were allowed to compete in biathlon, despite many of them enduring years of rigorous training. The USA team missed the first Women's European Cup but participated in the first Women's World Championship in Chamonix, France. The 22-year-old American, Carrie Swenson, started with the traditional 10 kilometers race. She finished 5th right after the Soviet athletes who were considered unbeatable leaders in the sport. In the 5 kilometers sprint, she was the best among her teammates, securing the 13th position. However, the real triumph for the team and personally for Carrie came in the relay. The Americans took the 3rd place, and Carrie and her teammates became the first medalists from the USA. After the biathlon season ended, Carrie returned home to Montana, where she planned her perfect summer. She got a job at a popular tourist ranch called Lone Mountain Ranch and spent all her free time trail running in the backcountry. Carrie opened the window, letting the fresh night air fill her bedroom. This morning, she graduated from Montana State University, receiving her degree in microbiology. After the ceremony, her parents threw a party, celebrating both her graduation and her brother Paul's 21st birthday. They had only one last summer at the Lone Mountain Ranch in the Big Sky area to practice and enjoy the mountains as they did in their childhood. One more year of competitions, and then she would leave to study veterinary medicine, a dream she had since she was 5 years old.
Carrie turned off the light in her room and happily drifted into sleep, unaware that her dreams would soon be shattered by the selfish plans of two recluses. Carrie had no idea about the conversation between the two men that took place in the mountains, several kilometers away from her. The younger man didn't hide his irritation. He generally enjoyed living away from people and their rules, but he felt lonely in the mountains and longed for female company. "Dad, do you remember the plans we discussed about getting ourselves a woman?" The father looked carefully at his 18-year-old son and asked, "Do you think the time has come?" In response, the son nodded confidently. On Sunday, July 15th, Carrie went for a run around Elray's Lake. She chose this route because Bob Sharp, the owner of the snack bar where she worked, had told her that he had seen a grizzly bear in the area, and she was eager to see it herself. As usual, Carrie ran fairly quickly, focusing on her breathing. Only at the last moment did she notice two men ahead of her. The strangers looked unkempt, they were not smiling, and the younger one had his hands on a pistol and a knife. Rifles were lying near a tree, even though the hunting season had long ended. Without taking their eyes off her, the men made Carrie realize that they had no good intentions. Unfortunately, she noticed them too late to turn around and run back. Fear triggered an adrenaline rush in her blood, and Carrie sprinted forward even faster, trying to pass the strangers as quickly as possible. However, her plan failed. The older man jumped right in front of her on the trail and grabbed her wrist. Not giving her a chance to react, he grabbed her other hand. Unable to break free from their grip, Carrie decided to rely on her wits and remain calm. The wild look in the older man's eyes frightened her. "Stay calm, don't provoke them," she thought. "Please, let me go," she said. "No, we don't come across pretty girls like you very often. We want to talk to you. What's your name?" he asked, holding Carrie even tighter. He began asking her various questions about whether she was married, who she lived with, and so on. Realizing that she wouldn't be released easily, Carrie tried to scream, but the man quickly silenced her. The stranger released her left hand, only to strike her in the face and then tie her up with a rope. The men said they would keep her with them for 4 or 5 days, and if she didn't like life in the mountains, they would let her go. However, from their smirks, she understood that they were more likely to take advantage of her vulnerability and eventually kill her. "It's just a nightmare," she repeated to herself, hoping to wake up at any moment, but the pulsating pain in her wrist and face indicated that it wasn't a dream. Carrie tried to appeal to their reason, explaining that her family and friends would look for her. In response, the older man threatened to shoot anyone who tried to rescue her. The men hurried on, wanting to move farther away from the lake and into the forest where they wouldn't be noticed. Carrie had no choice but to allow them to drag her along on the rope. Pretending to be submissive, she discreetly memorized the surrounding area to ensure she wouldn't run in the wrong direction when she got a chance to escape. The men walked side by side, chatting casually, as if kidnapping girls was an everyday occurrence for them. They discussed their views on society, laws, and the mountains. The older man expressed dissatisfaction with the region's development, particularly the fact that farmers were allowed to graze their livestock on his land. He told the younger man that he could learn everything necessary for life without returning to formal education or obeying society's laws. Such conversations made Carrie realize that her captors were likely mentally unstable. In an attempt to slow down their movement, Carrie asked for water and claimed she needed to rest. The men agreed to take a break. They approached a swamp, and to her horror, Carrie watched as the older man began drinking water from it. She tried to warn him about the dangerous bacteria present in the swamp, but he dismissed her concerns, saying it was the first time he'd heard of it. Reluctantly, she took a few sips as well. She noticed that the kidnappers behaved less aggressively when she pretended not to fear them. Carrie started cautiously questioning them about how long they've been living here without knowing about the dangers of drinking water from the local swamp. They replied that they were relatively new to the area but had been living in the mountains for 12 years. The younger man added with a smirk that they were desperately in need of female company, making Carrie feel even more uncomfortable. Afterward, they continued on their way. Carrie tried to step on soft ground and break twigs to leave clues for her family and friends who would search for her. Unfortunately, the older man noticed her efforts and thwarted them. Nevertheless, since she had nothing to lose, Carrie stubbornly kept leaving marks, and the older man kept erasing them. They continued this way, and when Carrie checked her watch, she realized that no one had started looking for her yet. It was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Meanwhile, Carrie's friend and colleague, Alan Goldstein, who taught shooting to guests at the ranch, began to wonder why her run was taking so long. He was afraid that she might have encountered a bear or twisted her ankle and couldn't make it back home on her own. Meanwhile, the strangers continued to lead Carrie further and further away from the ranch. After discussing how far they needed to go, they asked her if she could walk 60 kilometers in a day. She chose not to answer, revealing her capability of running 50 kilometers in hilly terrain during training to her captors was out of the question. If they thought she was weaker than she really was, they might move at a slower pace. She had no doubt now that they wouldn't let her live. Not now, not in 4 or 5 days. They wouldn't sacrifice their precious freedom for her. Carrie continued to subtly study the men. They not only shared a common philosophy but also bore a striking resemblance to each other. She started suspecting they were father and son. Carrie knew that people would soon start looking for her, but the thought of her parents or friends falling victim to her captors was far more terrifying than anything she had experienced so far. One way to avoid this was to escape. Since pleading didn't work, she decided to change tactics. Her tennis coach used to say, "Change your tactics when you're losing." Why continue playing a losing game when you have the opportunity to change your strategy? Around 5 p.m., the men decided to take a break for the night, but not before chaining her to a tree, severely limiting her chances of a possible escape. Mosquitoes and black flies were having a feast, with Carrie as their main dish. She was exhausted, hungry, thirsty, fearful for her life, and now chained. Near the tree, she noticed several rocks, one of which could be used to break a link in the chain at night. It was time to try the new strategy. Carrie decided to become unbearable. "Hey, I'm tired of standing by the tree. Loosen the chain so I can sit down," she demanded. The men looked bewildered but allowed her to sit. With her eyes closed as if resting, she secretly tried to reach for the rock. Unfortunately, the younger man noticed her attempt and removed all the rocks she could reach. Around 8 p.m., she continued to act obnoxious and demanded feminine items as she was freezing and being driven mad by the mosquitoes. The younger man, whom the older one called Dan, gave her a shirt and socks, and the older man started talking about how they had many of his ex-wife's things in the underground caves where they live. He went on about how cozy those caves were and that they would never be found there. Carrie heard a voice in the distance. Unfortunately, her captors heard it too. Simultaneously, a plane appeared in the sky. Carrie didn't know if the plane was searching for her, but the men got alarmed and quickly extinguished the campfire. They clearly didn't expect someone to search for the captive so soon. After circling the forest for about an hour, the plane flew away. With dread, Carrie awaited the upcoming night and what they would do to her. However, they left her to herself while sitting silently by the smoldering fire. As night fell, they provided her with one sleeping bag while they lay in another. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, the concern of Carrie's colleagues grew. 2 hours after she was supposed to show up for work, they started searching for her. Friends and family members of Carrie divided into 4 teams, each tasked with combing through their assigned areas. Carrie's father, Bob Svensson, got in touch with a friend who was a pilot to ask for help flying over the forest. Bob Sharp informed him about the possibility of Carrie encountering a grizzly bear on that trail, which filled him with dread. The teams searched for several hours, calling out her name as they combed the areas where Carrie was likely to run, but as darkness fell, they had to suspend the search. Carrie's brother, Paul found their father at the ranch after he returned from the airstrip. His father looked pale and restless with worry. Paul needed some time alone, so he asked his father to let him know as soon as there was any news about Carrie and went to his room. He quickly took a shower and lay down on his bed. Suddenly, he saw Carrie. She was tied to a log like some kind of captive animal. The men were sitting around a campfire nearby. His sister was crying. Paul woke up from this horrifying nightmare, not understanding what it could mean, and hoping that it was just a bad dream. With the dawn, they would resume the search, and they would surely find her. In the morning, the captors decided to move the camp to a different location, but to Carrie's surprise, they only shifted it about 50 meters from the original campsite. Despite the ongoing search for her, Dan didn't hesitate to go hunting with his firearm, shooting a squirrel for breakfast. While Dan was preparing breakfast, the older man demanded that Carrie hand over her shorts, stating that their bright red color attracted too much attention. He took them and went back to the old campsite. This presented an opportunity for Carrie to talk to Dan alone. She tried to persuade him to let her go back to her family, telling him that he was too young for such crimes. Dan looked at her attentively, with no hint of a smile, concern, or regret on his face, and said, "No, you're cute, and you'll stay with me." Meanwhile, the second kidnapper returned and gave Carrie her shorts, stained with soot from the previous campfire. Trying to hold back tears, Carrie started putting on the shorts inside her sleeping bag. She was almost done when she heard rustling in the bushes to her right and saw a person lying flat on the ground. Dan quickly got up and drew his gun from its holster. Carrie shouted, "Stay back. Don't come any closer. They're armed and they'll shoot." "Shut her up," the older man ordered, grabbing his rifle. "Go away. They'll kill you," Carrie shouted again when suddenly a deafening sound echoed, and she was thrown backward. The searing pain pierced her chest, and she smelled the gunpowder. Dan repeated in shock, "I didn't mean to shoot her. I didn't mean to." Incredibly, Carrie thought, she had been shocked just at the moment when rescue was so close. The kidnappers made no attempt to help her, but from the bushes to the left, another person emerged. It was another ranch employee, Jim Schwalbe. Apparently, he didn't realize that the kidnappers were criminals and assumed they were part of a rescue team trying to help Carrie, possibly scaring off a bear but accidentally hitting her. Jim rushed towards Carrie, dropping his backpack on the ground. It was only then that he saw the chain around her waist under the sleeping bag and began to understand the truth. He demanded that the older man remove the chain from Carrie, while he continued to be threatened with the rifle. Dan threw his gun to the ground and took out the key to the chain. Jim then addressed one of the kidnappers, Alan Goldstein, telling him to run for help. But apparently, Alan had already figured out their true nature. He shouted that he was armed and ordered the kidnappers to surrender because they were surrounded by 200 people. At that moment, Dan violently yanked the chain, and Carrie screamed in pain. When Jim turned to look at them, the older man aimed the rifle at Alan. "No," Carrie gasped. A shot rang out, and everyone heard something fall in the grass. Jim rushed to the fallen friend, but the kidnapper had already disappeared from sight. The older man reloaded the rifle and aimed it in Jim's direction, but he was too far away by then. The kidnappers quickly packed their belongings into their backpacks, took the chain, and even dumped Carrie out of her sleeping bag, stating that she wouldn't need it anymore. They made no attempt to help Carrie or Alan, leaving them both lying on the cold ground. Carrie heard the crackling of Alan's radio but didn't dare hope to reach it as he was lying too far away. The cold penetrated her entire body, and with her last bit of strength, she attempted to crawl towards the extinguished fire. Lying on her stomach, she tossed some twigs and leaves towards the fire, hoping that there were still warm logs that could help the leaves catch fire. Carrie tried to blow on them, but she was too weak and lost consciousness. When she woke up, she felt an army of black ants rushing towards her blood-soaked shirt. "No," she shooed them away. These insatiable insects reminded her of her thirst for life. She needed to find the radio and help Alan, but he had fallen too far away. However, she noticed Jim's backpack nearby. Her frozen fingers refused to cooperate, but finally, she managed to unfasten the backpack and found a water bottle, a chocolate bar, and a sleeping bag inside. The radio was not there. Carrie managed to put her legs into the sleeping bag and, finding some warmth, opened the water bottle. It turned out to be warm lemonade, and she took a sip and nibbled on the chocolate bar. Carrie once again tried to get closer to Alan, but this time, she had to drag the sleeping bag along with her. She couldn't help but feel like a caterpillar crawling on the ground and imagined how her brother Paul would react to that image. He would probably laugh and cheer her on at every step. She chuckled at the silly thoughts that come to mind in such moments. About 1.5 kilometers from the shootout site, other search teams continued their efforts, unaware of what had happened. Suddenly, Jim Schwalbe interrupted them. Gasping for breath, he shouted to the people surrounding him, there were 2 guys. They tied Carrie to a log and shot her when she yelled at us to stay away. Bob asked him if she was alive. She was when I ran away, but that scoundrel shot her, and the old man got Alan in the head. With every breath, life was leaving Carrie. Breathing became incredibly difficult, exacerbating the bleeding. A decision came to her intuitively. She closed her eyes and found herself back on the biathlon track. Biathletes practice their breathing technique methodically, just like speed and accuracy. Carrie focused, and very slow breathing, almost like in yoga, allowed her to slow down her heart rate and bleeding. Annoying flies buzzed around her, but strangely, they helped her stay conscious. She thought about Jim. He should have brought help by now, unless he ran into the kidnappers again. After a few hours, that annoying buzzing sound returned. Carrie looked around in search of the source and spotted a helicopter hovering above the treetops. It paused directly over her, and people were peering out of it. "Please, find us quickly," she silently pleaded. The helicopter flew away, but suddenly she heard the cracking of branches and the sound of a radio. "Help," she cried out with all her remaining strength. "Here she is," someone shouted. "We found her." "Are you okay, Carrie? Can you hear me?" asked a man. "Yes," she replied. She wanted to shout, scream, thank them for finding her, but all she could manage was a smile. Her eyelids felt heavy as if filled with lead, and it was hard to see what was happening next. While Carrie was being taken to the hospital, the police put all their efforts into finding her kidnappers. Little did they know it would be the beginning of a months-long search. The local forests and mountains cover hundreds of kilometers, and no one knows them better than the 2 fugitives. Over the course of 5.5 months, the kidnappers managed to elude the police successfully, and the media romanticized their image, calling them mountain men from another era. They portrayed Ran as a handsome prince and the other man as stern and loving father. It even reached a point where a local businessman wanted to sell T-shirts with their images. Meanwhile, the journalists overlooked the victims of their crimes. Then, about 2 weeks before Christmas, Sheriff Johnny France received an unexpected tip-off. One of his relatives noticed smoke on his ranch property in the woods. France had grown up on that ranch and knew every inch of it. It was dark, the radio had intermittent signals in the mountains, and the criminals could disappear at any moment. Nevertheless, the sheriff rushed to their camp. "Why did I go there alone? Because that's what I was paid for," he joked years later. He arrived as quickly as he could on a snowmobile, tracked down the father and son, and had them in his sights. The father immediately pulled out his rifle and threatened to shoot. In response, the sheriff warned that 2 shots would be fired at his son. He had to use the boy as leverage to get the father to listen. The sheriff convinced them that they could finally warm up, eat properly, and take a shower, which worked. Within minutes, the situation was fully under the sheriff's control. The kidnappers, Dan Nichols and his father, Don Nichols, were arrested and charged with kidnapping. Don was also charged with the murder of Alan Goldstein. At the trial, it was revealed that the men had planned the kidnapping several years ago. Dan refused to live in the mountains without a woman, and since not every girl would agree to their way of life, about 5 to 6 years ago, Don Nichols purchased a chain for his future bride. He dreamed of founding his own clan, living away from society, and Carrie was destined to play the role of the mother to his son's future offspring. Don was sentenced to 85 years in prison, but he was released in 2017. Dan was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he only served 6 years. It seemed that the young man had turned his life around, getting married, getting an education, and deciding to help disabled people. However, in 2012, he was arrested again in connection with illegal substances. As for Carrie, she spent 8 days in the hospital, and immediately after being discharged, she began pushing the boundaries of her own physical abilities, overcoming pain to speed up her recovery. By 1986, Carrie had recovered enough to participate in biathlon competitions in Oslo, Norway. She achieved a 4th place, but the athlete who finished 3rd invited her to stand with her on the podium, acknowledging her merits. To others, it might have seemed that she had fully recovered, but Carrie knew that the kidnapping and injury had left a lasting mark that would never disappear. She continued to experience pain from scar tissue and the bullet shrapnel still lodged in her body, affecting nearby nerves during significant physical exertion. As a result, she decided to quit competitive sports and focus on a career as a veterinarian, heading to study in Colorado. Today, Carrie Swenson works as a veterinarian in Bozeman, Montana, and continues to enjoy outdoor activities, which she has loved since her early childhood. She rarely talks about the events that happened and has become a harsh critic of the media's coverage of the kidnapping. In particular, she found the romanticizing of the kidnappers and murderers as rugged mountain men skilled in wilderness survival to be inappropriate. She also believed that the media significantly downplayed the emotional trauma of the abduction, portraying the experience as more romantic than it truly was in the hands of the mountain people. In 2012, when Dana was arrested again, Carrie wrote an article for the local newspaper, mocking the so-called mountain men. The Nicholses may have lived in the mountains at times, but they couldn't survive there, at least not without theft and robbery, often leaving the woods for months and buying modern equipment. In the end, they were so easy to catch because they froze, starved, and grew tired of mountain life. They are no true mountain men, she wrote. Brent Poole took his wife's hand and surveyed the stretch of sandy beach between the Atlantic Ocean and vast dunes. They strolled slowly past private beach houses, and as they were engulfed by the darkness of the last untouched miles of forest running alongside the shore, the young man once again marveled at how romantic Myrtle Beach was. Situated between South Carolina and North Carolina, it was at the heart of the popular Grand Strand Beach. Like many tourists before him, Brent was enchanted by the rhythmic movement of the waves crashing onto the white sandy beach. Hand in hand with his beloved wife, he felt warm and joyful in his heart. Chuckling like a boy, Brent suggested to Renee, "Let's do it right here." The girl smiled and began to undress. A light breeze blowing in from the ocean cooled their naked bodies as the young couple enjoyed each other's company. After a while, Brent helped Renee get dressed, and he checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. They needed to head back to the hotel. Walking back hand in hand, they made plans for the future. In the distance, they noticed a large man dressed in black, his body covered tightly. But it wasn't just his appearance that frightened them, it was the fact that the man, who was initially heading in a different direction, suddenly turned and started following them. They picked up their pace, but they couldn't shake him off. The man ran ahead and leapt in front of them. He wore a ski mask, and in his hands was a gun that he pointed at the young couple. The weapon was black and looked almost like a plastic toy. The man ordered them to lie down on the ground. This guy is crazy, Renee thought. Brent remembered that he had an army Swiss knife in his pocket, which he bought at a flea market for Christmas, but what could he do with a knife against a gun? The stranger demanded that they hand over all their valuables. After taking their jewelry and money, the robber aimed the gun at Brent. He pulled the trigger once, twice, 3 times, but the gun refused to fire. While the robber confidently reloaded the weapon, a terrified Renee hoped that it was all just a tasteless joke and that he would leave soon. Then the man aimed the gun at Brent again. Brent begged him to spare his life. The robber smirked, glanced at Renee, and asked why he should spare him. "Because I have a daughter whom I love very much," Brent replied firmly. The shooter's eyes narrowed. He put the gun under Brent's chin and made him kneel. He pulled the trigger for the 4th time. Only this time, there was no misfire. Brent probably didn't hear the shot or feel it. But the shooter seemed unsatisfied and fired again. He wanted to make sure Brent was dead, although there was no need. The stranger turned and walked toward Renee, who lay on the sand, trembling with fear. She thought she would be the next one, but the stranger simply turned abruptly and ran toward the dunes. Renee got on her knees and called her husband's name softly through her tears. Just 10 minutes ago, they were celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary, making plans for the future, joyfully discussing their little daughter Katie's first trip to the ocean. Renee sat by Brent, frightened and shocked. It's unclear how long she stayed in that state, but finally, she realized she needed to call for help. She remembered seeing a patrol car in the distance with her husband. With difficulty, she staggered in that direction. On June 9, 1998, shortly before midnight, Myrtle Beach patrolman Scott Brown was cruising along the deserted coastline of the Grand Strand when the headlights of his SUV suddenly caught sight of a girl frantically waving at him in the darkness. She was in a state of hysteria, and it's not surprising given what she told the patrolman. It was far beyond anything Scott was used to dealing with, like stolen wallets. But a stolen wallet was just the beginning of Renee's story. The masked stranger dressed in black had robbed them, and then he shot her husband twice in the head. The girl recounted how they obediently did everything the stranger told them, but it didn't save them. Scott, who had recently become a patrolman, was stunned upon hearing what had happened. Nonetheless, he quickly got his bearings and called for backup. On the crime scene, the arriving police officers found casings indicating that the perpetrator had used an automatic or semi-automatic weapon, which he took with him. This meant that the criminal was armed and possibly looking for another victim in the popular tourist area of the Grand Strand. The city's police, heavily reliant on tourism, could not afford another murder. They dedicated all their resources to finding the robber. The search led K9 units up to the road, but if the killer had a car, no one had seen it. Meanwhile, the police took Renee to the station, where they checked her hands for gunpowder residue as a precautionary measure. They didn't find any. The police had no reason to suspect her, but the entire scenario of what had happened was troubling. A random beach robbery was unusual in itself, but a robbery and murder on the beach was almost unheard of. The strangest part of Renee's story, from the police's perspective, was that she survived to tell it. If the robber decided to shoot his victim in the head to eliminate a potential witness, then why leave Renee alive? She wasn't even tied up, and she was not struck or gagged. Renee recounted that the gun clicked, as if there were no more bullets left. The casings found on the beach seemed to confirm her words. According to her account, it appeared that it was her lucky day. Meanwhile, the police had the difficult task of informing the parents of the 24-year-old young man that their son had been killed. Interestingly, the first thing the parents asked was whether his wife was with him. And then they revealed to the police the unusual dynamics of the marital couple. Growing up in the suburbs of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Renee always had a way with guys. She caught Brent bullseye in a serendipitous encounter in 1991 when they met in the school parking lot. A friend of Brent asked him to give Renee a ride home, and during that ride, Brent invited her on a date. Their whirlwind romance led to the news that they would become parents in March 1995, just 3 months after Renee turned 17. Brent proposed to Renee, traditionally getting down on one knee. Both of their families were unsure if they would be able to handle the responsibilities of parenthood. Fortunately, at 21 years old, Brent already had a promising career as a mechanic, working double shifts and making a decent income for a young man. Brent and Renee even managed to buy a small house in a residential area near Winston-Salem. At first glance, it seemed like things were going well for the young couple, but after the birth of their daughter in 1996, financial problems began to arise. To overcome their financial struggles, at Brent's suggestion, Renee took up a job as an exotic dancer at a local club in the spring of the following year. Brent was proud of his wife's job, and Renee enjoyed her new lifestyle. Her new job promised to help the family forget about their financial woes, with earnings ranging from $200 to $400 per night. However, Renee brought more than just cash home from the club. She became involved with some of her female co-workers, and according to rumors circulating in the club, Brent was supportive of these relationships. It seemed that he was open to experimenting in their marriage. But one of Renee's affairs turned out to be more serious than she had anticipated. In the spring of 1998, Renee began dating John Boyd Frazier, a computer systems technician and a DJ from the club. John was a pleasant young man, known for being generous with the ladies. Rumors suggested that this aspect of him was what attracted Renee to him. As Brent spent more time with his friends and, in Renee's opinion, didn't help her enough with their child, she decided to pack her bags, take their 2-year-old daughter, and move in with John. However, just a few days after the move, Renee met with a lawyer who explained to her that given her occupation as an exotic dancer and her relatively liberal views on relationships, she was unlikely to secure full custody of her daughter. This made Renee reconsider her decision to leave her husband. Renee packed her things and returned home to her husband. Brent, who was willing to do anything to keep Renee, welcomed her back with open arms. To celebrate their reconciliation, the whole family went on vacation to Myrtle Beach. The family vacation started off wonderfully, with them all enjoying a few days basking in the sun on the beach. However, on the evening of June 9th, on the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, Renee and Brent decided to spend the evening just the two of them. Renee had arranged for a babysitter for their daughter, Katie, at the hotel, but when the sitter arrived, their plans were almost derailed as Katie started crying. Brent tried to comfort their daughter, but Renee practically pushed him out of the hotel room. The couple visited 2 night spots, had dinner, and had a few cocktails. Then, a little after 11 o'clock, they decided to take advantage of the many secluded spots near their hotel. What happened next was known to the police. Upon learning the name of Renee's lover, the Myrtle Beach police called Salem to request an immediate visit to John's house and verify if he was there. They also spoke with Renee again. She confirmed the statements made by Brent's parents. Renee admitted that she had been involved with other men, including her affair with John, but claimed that all those affairs were in the past. However, she was uncertain if John agreed with her on this. Under pressure from the detectives, Renee admitted that she wasn't sure. By 5 a.m. on June 10th, Brent had been dead for 5 hours, and the Myrtle Beach police had a suspect in the murder, John Frazier. Detectives found out that he had called in sick to work on that day when he was supposed to be working. Unfortunately for the investigators, when they knocked on John's door, he was at home. It was almost impossible for him to travel to Myrtle Beach, commit the crime, return, change clothes, and then open the door for the police. The police had no choice but to apologize, wish him a good night, and leave. The police took up the investigation again with Renee. She came to the station accompanied by a lawyer, not a criminal defense attorney, but one who had helped her sister in her divorce. Renee repeated her story when suddenly her lawyer interrupted the conversation. He asked to speak with his client alone, but just when the investigators thought the conversation was over, they faced an unexpected surprise. Upon returning to the interrogation room, the lawyer instructed Renee to tell everything she knew, and Renee confessed that John was the one who pulled the trigger that night. She recognized him by his voice and mannerisms. Justifying herself, she claimed that she had to convince herself first that it was him. Now the police had to find out how John ended up on a secluded beach in another city on June 9th. Fortunately, a witness appeared at the right time. Bruce Wolford, a bartender at the club where Renee worked and John's friend, heard Renee talking to John about her plans to go to Myrtle Beach with her husband for their wedding anniversary. He also mentioned seeing John attempting to fight Brent on one occasion. In John's daily planner, the police found a note under June 9th that said Renee and Brent, although it was later discovered that he simply marked all the important dates of his friends and acquaintances. John was immediately arrested, but unlike Renee, he didn't give away a single word. The investigators believed that they would get the whole story from Renee. She made a mistake when she recanted her initial testimony. She was arrested right next to the funeral home and taken in for questioning. The detective did everything possible to extract information from Renee, even if it meant deceiving her. Although John Frazier refused to speak, the detective falsely told Renee that John had confessed to killing her husband at her request. They threatened her, saying that she would never see her daughter again unless she accused John of the crime and revealed where he had hidden the weapon. Gradually, after a 2-hour interrogation, Renee's story began to change. She confessed that she knew about John's threats to kill Brent but didn't take her lover's words seriously. The next day, Renee was accused of murder, and the prosecutor decided to insist on the harshest punishment for her. Her defense attorney, who specializes in criminal cases, demanded that she withdraw her confession. The case against Renee was essentially based on the fact that John was the shooter. However, the prosecutors faced serious difficulties. Apart from Renee's confession, they had no other evidence. To prove that Renee lured her husband out of the hotel room to set up John as the shooter, they needed a witness who could link her lover to the crime scene. And they found 2 witnesses right away. 2 elderly individuals were also staying at the same hotel as the couple and coincidentally celebrating their wedding anniversary there. On the day after the murder, they contacted the police to report that they had been on the beach the previous evening and saw a man dressed in black who frightened them. They identified John from a photograph, claiming that he appeared suspicious and they remembered his face. Although this statement immediately raised many doubts because it was nighttime and the beach had limited lighting, making it unlikely for them to clearly see a man at a considerable distance. Nevertheless, the prosecutors attempted to convict Renee, hoping that her accomplice would then admit guilt. Renee's guilt hinged on what she knew about John's plan. However, if John was not the murderer, then she had no connection to the crime at all. Detectives managed to pressure the shocked girl into confessing, which became the primary evidence against her in the case. Renee lost 15 pounds during this ordeal. They desperately needed a confession to prevent tourists from fearing to visit the city. It was crucial for them to portray Brent's death as something other than a random robbery. Renee's defense attorney believes that she was convicted for her lifestyle. However, the prosecutors argued that her lifestyle had a more significant impact on Brent. Being unfaithful to her husband and working in such a profession made divorce not an option for her. It seemed more logical to get rid of Brent. Her reunion with her husband was just one step in her fatal betrayal because being with her boyfriend during her husband's murder did not play in her favor. The jury deliberated for a long time and finally found the prosecution's arguments more compelling. Kimberly Renee Poole was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial of John, who had no intention of admitting guilt, took place shortly after that. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison despite the lack of actual evidence against him. The prosecutors didn't even call Bruce Wolford to testify. If Bruce had been a reliable witness, the prosecutors would have been eager to put him on the stand and convince the jury that John was the only person with a motive to remove Brent Poole from the picture. The problem was that there were several people who liked Renee and saw her husband as an obstacle, and Bruce Wolford was at the top of that list. Darrell Wilson, a private detective hired by John Fraser's mother, thoroughly investigated the case and came to the conclusion that Bruce was just as likely a suspect as John. The former police officer spoke not only with Bruce but also with many other witnesses involved in the case. In particular, he found Chris Hensley, another witness completely ignored by the police, who had a much better view and recollection of what happened on the beach that night. Firstly, he deduced what Renee and Brent were doing on the beach after seeing Brent's unbuttoned shirt. Secondly, he encountered a man dressed in black who passed very close to him, and Chris even greeted him out of politeness. According to Chris, the composite sketch based on his description didn't resemble John at all. However, when the private detective showed Chris a computer-generated composite and pictures of Bruce, Chris stated that the man in the photo matched the composite sketch very closely based on what he remembered about the person's height, hair, and face. Even more incriminating was the fact that Bruce had installed spyware on Renee's home computer, giving him complete control over her computer. This allowed him to monitor Renee's activities for 6 months, knowing everything about her whereabouts and plans, and reading all her emails and messages. Bruce became even more suspicious given that he owned a semi-automatic pistol and had access to a white van with a number sticker on the window, similar to the one witnesses saw on the beach before the murder. By killing Brent and framing John for the crime, Bruce could eliminate 2 rivals at once. After the trial, a campaign for the review of Renee's case began. Her new attorney filed an appeal on the grounds that her predecessor had performed poorly in her duties. The court-appointed public defender only met with Renee once before the trial, and that was just to push her to agree to a 30-year sentence in exchange for confessing to conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecutors implanted in the minds of the jury the idea that there was no robbery at all because approximately a month after the murder, Brent's wallet was found in the yard of a nearby house with $9 in cash, Brent's driver's license, and a bank card he used to pay for dinner at a restaurant. However, the defense attorney could easily prove that $50 were missing from Brent's wallet, which he had withdrawn from an ATM on the night of the murder to pay the babysitter. Moreover, the babysitter's testimony about Renee's alleged haste was misinterpreted. The babysitter could only sit with the child from 9 p.m. to 12 a.m., and she got lost, took some time to find the right hotel, and was 15 minutes late. Therefore, Renee was in a hurry to go for a walk with her husband just to spend more time with him within the 3-hour time frame allocated for babysitting. These are not all the facts that were not presented by the defense at the trial. In particular, there were electronic emails confirming that it was Brent who suggested going to Myrtle Beach. So, it wasn't Renee who lured her husband to a secluded beach. It was Brent who wanted to add some excitement to their intimate life, which is why they bought a beach towel on the way back from the restaurant at 10:52 p.m. Since they were supposed to go back home the next day, it was their last evening when Brent's desire could be fulfilled. Everything happened spontaneously. If it was premeditated, Renee would have taken a small towel with her to ensure nothing hindered the execution of her plan. Moreover, if the murder was planned, it would have been more logical for Renee to keep her husband in a secluded, wooded area until her accomplice arrived. However, the crime occurred as they were returning to the hotel. When they noticed a stranger following them, they hurried their pace. Brent even had time to draw his knife and potentially alter the situation in his favor. The Brent family has initiated an investigation along this path, claiming that Renee is responsible for everything. They have turned against her, blaming her for the moral choices their son made and desired. Renee's attorney should emphasize that Brent himself wanted her to work as a stripper and engage in relationships with other people, undermining the prosecution's theory. As Renee continues to fight for what is called mitigation of punishment after the verdict, she serves her sentence in prison. Brent's parents have been granted custody of Katie, although Renee managed to build a healthy and loving relationship with her daughter. In prison, Renee creates Braille textbooks for blind children, and her colleagues and supervisors highly value her work. To this day, she maintains her claim of innocence and insists that she does not know who robbed them with Brent and shot her husband. On April 14, 2023, 2 friends, 32-year-old Siraporn Kanwong and 36-year-old Sararat Rangsaiwathaporn, commonly known as M, arrived at the Mekong riverbank in Ratchaburi, Thailand, to release fish into the river. This act of kindness, a virtuous deed, essentially constituted a traditional Buddhist ceremony. A surveillance camera captured Siraporn as she walked along the riverside pier, carrying the fish. She appeared lively and perfectly healthy. However, just moments later, Siraporn collapsed and passed away. Bystanders attempted to help her, but it was already too late. The sudden loss of her daughter during a routine outing with a friend shocked Siraporn's mother. She shared her suspicions with the police because her daughter had recently become friends with M. Furthermore, she was troubled by the disappearance of her daughter's belongings, an expensive handbag, around 40,000 baht in cash, a little over $1,000, and 2 mobile phones. The police initiated an investigation and attempted to gather details from M about the incident. Surprisingly, M claimed that she wasn't with her friend during the river incident. However, surveillance footage painted a different picture. When bystanders tried to save Siraporn's life, her friend fled in the opposite direction. Only after irrefutable evidence was presented did M admit that she was at the river during the Buddhist ceremony. Forensic experts examined Siraporn's blood and stomach contents, confirming investigators and the deceased's family's suspicions by detecting traces of cyanide in her kidneys. M was arrested on April 25th, and during a search of her house, a bottle of cyanide was found. When news of Siraporn's suspicious death reached the media, several other families contacted the police, suddenly realizing that their loved ones had also died after last being seen in M's company. M was a graduate of Nakhon Pathom Rajapat University, located slightly west of Bangkok. During her time there, she didn't stand out, and her professors cannot recall anything unusual about her appearance or behavior. She obtained her diploma in 2009 and became a specialist in the field of public relations. From 2012 to 2022, over the course of 10 years, she worked as a representative for at least 3 leading insurance agencies in the Thai market. Investigators were relieved to find out that there were no insurance claims made for any of the 12 policies M had sold. M was married to a police officer named Witun Rangsai Wathaporn, with whom she lived until 2022. During this time, Witun rose to the rank of a lieutenant colonel, and the couple had 2 children. They lived in an apartment provided by the police force, where their neighbors were fellow police officers. Neighbors remember M as reserved and only interacting with well-off police families. In 2022, the couple separated fairly amicably as they continued to live together for some time afterward. However, by the end of 2022, M started seeing a 35-year-old man named Satizak Pungkun. The two were expecting a child, as M was 4 months pregnant. Unfortunately, on March 12, 2023, her boyfriend unexpectedly passed away, leading the police to now believe that he too fell victim to poisoning. After having dinner, Satizak suddenly lost consciousness at a gas station. He was taken to the hospital, discharged, but unfortunately passed away the next day. Later, it became known to investigators that M had called her ex-husband, who came to her from Bangkok to Udon Thani. The former spouses got into Satizak's car and without much hesitation, they went to apply for a loan, using the car as collateral. After that, they attempted to visit people to whom Satizak had lent money and tried to collect all these debts. In reality, M wanted to gain much more after her boyfriend's death. A representative from the insurance company contacted the police and shared that M had wanted to insure the man's life for 7 million baht or $200,000, but the regular insurance premium would have been 1,000 baht or $28, and she decided against pursuing this idea. With each new piece of information about M, investigators grew more horrified. 15 friends, aged 33 to 45, who had previously never complained about their health, suddenly fell ill after spending time with M. 14 of them passed away shortly after being in her company. This group even included 2 police officers. Police Major Nipa Sanjan passed away on April 1, 2023, due to respiratory and cardiac failure. She collapsed immediately after going with M to pray at Prapatam Cheri in Nakhon Pathom. The police shared surveillance footage that captured the poisoning incident, and watching it is an emotional experience. Nipa was sitting on a bench when she suddenly became unwell. She curled up, hit her head, fell to the ground, and lay motionless. What was her friend M doing at that moment? She was talking on the phone, with her hand resting on her side. At some point, she walked away from Nipa, completely ignoring her. She didn't even make an attempt to pretend to help. But was it worth expecting any semblance of care from her, considering she had already claimed 12 victims? Police Captain Kunda Torai didn't fare well after befriending M either. Kunda had just borrowed money from her friend before she was found lifeless in her car on August 10, 2022. There were no signs of trauma on her body. The car's dashcam, smartwatch, iPad, and mobile phone had all disappeared. The earliest murder linked to M dates back to 2015, involving the death of Montatip Kauin, known to everyone as Sai. M and Sai had been friends since childhood. While Sai wasn't exactly wealthy, she often lent various amounts of money to M. After marrying a foreigner, Sai moved to another country. However, in 2015, she returned to Thailand, and M picked her up from the airport in her car upon her arrival. Soon after, Sai passed away due to acute heart failure. Sai's mother remembers that M quickly intervened at the time, supposedly to handle her financial matters as per Sai's husband's request. Sai's family was shocked by her sudden death but believed it was fate. Yet, when news of M's accusations surfaced, they contacted the police, suspecting a connection, especially considering M had abruptly cut off all communication with Sai's family. As far as investigators know, after this incident, M refrained from committing crimes until 2020. However, from 2020 to 2023, 13 of her friends died. The symptoms they experienced were associated with cyanide poisoning. Some of them passed away after lending money to the suspect, while others had valuable items go missing. Kantima Pezard, who lent a substantial sum of money to M, believes that she could have been the 15th victim of the serial poisoner known as M cyanide, as dubbed by journalists. Kantima had recently become friends with M. They went together to a large shopping center, but about a week before this, Kantima lent M 250,000 baht, approximately $7,000. While shopping, Kantima complained of a sore throat and feeling under the weather. M then gave her a cough medicine, likely of herbal origin. Kantima took the medicine, got into her car, and started driving home when she suddenly felt a heaviness in her chest. She attempted to call M, but M ignored her call. Fortunately, Kantima managed to reach the emergency medical hotline. By the time help arrived, she had stopped breathing, but medics were able to nearly bring her back to life. M never communicated with her again and didn't return the money. Now, of course, Kantima is certain that she could have become one of M's victims if help hadn't arrived in time. She reported her story to the police. M cyanide's motive confirms the conclusions of a criminological study that suggests the motive of female serial killers is often driven by the desire for enrichment or gain from people close to them. In contrast, for male serial killers, the motive is usually tied to satisfying their intimate needs and preying on victims. M cyanide was addicted to gambling and had a desperate need to continue funding her addiction. She regularly visited gambling websites, and the police reported that somehow she lost nearly 1 million baht in a single day, which is approximately $28,000. Overall, the woman spent around 78 million baht on her addiction, over $2 million, which she obtained from her victims. Some of the money went toward paying off debts and obligations that M had accumulated due to her addiction, but not all of them were settled, and she continued to gamble with the rest. Law enforcement officers tried to identify the recipients of these funds and determine if any of these people were involved in the murders. While it's evident they weren't involved in the murders, the police are dismayed by the fact that online gambling websites continue to flourish in Thailand, generating significant profits for organized crime in the country and causing immense suffering for those who fall into their traps. The natural question arises, how did M convince her well-off acquaintances to give her money? After all, some of them had known her only recently, and it's unlikely that they would trust a new acquaintance so much. In reality, some people had known her since childhood, while others trusted her as a police officer's wife. Many of the victims were involved in financial schemes resembling pyramid schemes that M was part of. She would enter the lives of these affluent individuals, gaining their trust before various means of obtaining their money, including pyramid schemes, lottery fraud, shady investments, or simply borrowing money. Often, she would ask for small sums, and perhaps her well-off friends felt uncomfortable refusing her. Furthermore, in several cases, she managed to gain financial benefits even after poisoning her victims. For example, she assured the relatives of the deceased that she would handle all their affairs, gaining control. When victims inquired about getting their money back, she would invite them to lunch or on a trip and then introduce cyanide. Why didn't anyone notice that over a dozen acquaintances of M had died under suspicious circumstances? Because the poisoner operated in different provinces of the country, and until 2023, none of these cases were investigated. It's also important to note that the poisoner wasn't always in immediate proximity to the victims. For instance, Nimnakit, the wife of a doctor, passed away after ingesting a tablet sent to her by the poisoner via mail. The woman's husband believed his wife died due to constant fatigue and stress after giving birth to their little daughter. The poisoner had significant influence over Nem there to tell the young mother that she had gained weight during her pregnancy. She sent her a weight loss tablet. On November 23rd, just a month after giving birth, she sent another tablet, but it was dirty and Nim couldn't take it. On the 25th of the same month, after taking the second tablet, Nim passed away. At that time, her husband wasn't at home, and her 2 children were left alone with the deceased mother until a neighbor came at the husband's request. Even though the woman's husband was a medical professional, he didn't suspect M and believe his wife had died of a heart condition they weren't aware of. A renowned forensic expert laments that Thailand lacks a coroner's office, which would be responsible for investigating sudden and suspicious deaths. In his opinion, if such a position existed, similar to those in the UK, Australia, and the US, M's crimes could have been uncovered sooner and many lives could have been saved. M. Cyanide did not admit her guilt in the crimes, despite the efforts of the police. The lead investigator on the case explained that they only managed to get a partial admission from her regarding her involvement in the death of the latest victim, Siraporn. She made a vague statement suggesting that cyanide had been mixed with illicit substances, which the victim ingested. However, the investigator doesn't believe this story. The reason is quite simple. Who would mix cyanide with prohibited substances, especially considering that cyanide is an extremely dangerous poison, and any dosage of it is associated with an immediate risk of death. Due to M's lack of confession, investigators were eager to identify the exact source of the cyanide and understand how she managed to easily access it over such a long period from 2015 to 2023. The cyanide used by the poisoner was the Spanish brand Pan Riac, which is imported to Thailand by one of the 15 Thai companies. The lead investigator believed that someone helped M purchase the poison. It was revealed that her sister owns a pharmacy, but investigators were particularly interested in individuals who bought the substance with the same batch number as the one found in M's house. Among the 100 buyers, Thai actress Ice was identified. Possession of cyanide without permission is illegal in Thailand, and all buyers were summoned for questioning. Ice admitted to purchasing cyanide online on April 25th for 3,000 baht. She claims she intended to use it against snakes and monitor lizards that posed a threat to her dogs and even provided a video as evidence. Ice's mother confirmed that the sealed bottle was still at their home and they would bring it to the police station for questioning. The police didn't press charges against Ice. Nevertheless, social media users criticized her, insinuating that she might become the next serial killer and referencing her manager's death 3 years ago, trying to link it to cyanide. This is likely more indicative of the current state of social media rather than any real suspicions about her. As for where M obtained the poison, the police haven't yet disclosed whether they've managed to uncover any information on that matter. After 3 months, the investigation into the horrific cases of cyanide poisonings came to an end. The chief investigator stated that the police had interviewed over 900 witnesses and examined 26,500 documents. He noted that this is a historic case for Thailand, where the suspect planned serial killings over an 8-year period, poisoning victims with cyanide. The symptoms of cyanide poisoning, which medical professionals often mistake for natural health issues, such as stroke or heart attack, prevented doubts from arising in the minds of the victims' relatives. Her main goal was to obtain funds from the victims and eliminate the debts that burdened her. M. Cyanide has been charged with approximately 80 counts, an unprecedented number in Thailand's history. In addition to attempted murder and intentional homicide of 14 individuals, she is accused of food and drug adulteration, theft, and document forgery. Her former lawyer, Fanicha Ikchuanawat, and her ex-husband have been charged with aiding and abetting. Her ex-husband was dismissed from his job and arrested after his connection to forged documents and possession of stolen property, particularly victims' jewelry, was discovered. Despite this, he was released on bail and placed under electronic monitoring due to the lack of direct evidence linking him to the murders. Additionally, some leniency was shown towards him after expressing a willingness to meet his ex-wife in prison and convince her to confess to the poisonings. If she confesses to the crimes, she might expect some leniency from the court. Otherwise, she could face the death penalty. When news of the charges against M emerged in April 2023, some families of the victims demanded the death penalty for her. However, some legal experts suggested that her life would likely be spared even if she is found guilty. This is due to the Criminal Procedure Code, which was amended in 2007, preventing the execution of a pregnant defendant. Although the death penalty can be postponed for 3 years, the punishment will automatically be commuted to life imprisonment if her child is alive after 3 years. Unfortunately, it later became known that M had lost her child, making her ineligible for this provision of the law. The police emphasized that the maximum punishment she faces is the death penalty. Currently, she is held in a women's prison in Bangkok and reportedly enjoys popularity among the inmates. The government has announced impending changes to the regulations for purchasing cyanide in Thailand. Importers will be required to provide detailed information about all buyers, whether individuals, businesses, or factories. Providing the reason for the purchase will be mandatory. If importers fail to provide this information to the police every 3 months, their licenses will be revoked. If M is found guilty of the numerous poisonings, her name will be added to the list of serial killers in Thailand over the past 100 years. Up until this point, the list had only included male names. The roster of infamous murderers who've struck fear into the country's residents includes Boonpeng Heap Lek, also known as Iron Chest Boonpeng, publicly beheaded in 1919 for not only taking victims' lives but also placing bodies in boxes and throwing them into a canal. He killed between 2 and 7 people. Among recent criminals, Samkid Pampwang, known as Kid the Ripper, stands out. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of 5 masseuses in 2005. Chamol Nert Solkwan allegedly poisoned at least 8 truck drivers in 2011 to 2012 but died before being convicted. The list also features Si Ui, a convicted child killer who was executed in 1959, and the notorious adventurer Charles Sobrage, who managed to escape police custody in the 1970s after murdering 12 people. He earned nicknames like the Bikini Killer due to the attire of his victims and the Serpent for his skilled deception and ability to evade justice. He's the only one whose victim count compares to that of the one woman who is likely to join this list, M. Cyanide. Jose was not an ordinary guy, quite the opposite. He felt that he could get anything he wanted from life, not because he was capable or deserving of it, but simply because he desired it so much. He didn't like blending in with the crowd. He wanted to stand out, to make people tremble with fear at the sight of him. Jose was tough, just like his friends. They always had each other's backs, did everything together, and on that night when Jose saw a ring with the letter E engraved on it, he knew he had to have it because his girlfriend's name was Esther. He thought it would be a perfect romantic gesture. So he leaned over and took the ring off the lifeless girl's hand, a girl he and his friends had just killed. Jennifer Lee Ertman, who was 14 years old, and Elizabeth Christine Pena, who was 16, were best friends. Despite Jennifer being younger, she was obedient and well-mannered, and her positive influence had a wonderful impact on her friend Elizabeth. Elizabeth's parents were delighted that their daughter had such a reliable, faithful, and fantastic friend. The two girls shared an interest in makeup and fashion. They enjoyed dressing uniquely, skillfully applying makeup, and choosing accessories. They attended the same school in Houston, Texas, and were currently on summer vacation. Thursday, June 24, 1993 came around. A friend invited Elizabeth and Jennifer to a poolside party. At 4:45 p.m., Jennifer's father, Randy, dropped her off at Elizabeth's house, where at 8 p.m., Elizabeth's mother, Melissa, drove the girls to their friend Gina's house, who was hosting the party. The girls were excited and thrilled, enjoying the pleasant warm summer evening in the company of friends. Time flew by unnoticed, and the hour when their parents would expect them to be home was approaching. In principle, the parents weren't afraid to let the girls go out in the evening. They had cash with them just in case. Jennifer carried a pager and always kept $10 for a taxi in her pocket. And if they wanted their parents to pick them up, they only needed to find a telephone or a payphone and call. But this time, the girls decided to walk home. As they said their goodbyes to all their friends, the clock struck 10:45 and they were feeling the pressure of time. The girls had two options for walking home on foot. They could have taken the usual route by walking along the boulevard and turning onto the street leading to Elizabeth's house. This path would have taken them about half an hour. On the other hand, the park offered the possibility of saving 10 to 15 minutes. Despite their concerns about being late, they decided to go through the park. The route involved walking through the park, crossing a railway bridge, following a path, and eventually arriving at Elizabeth's house. Of course, at night, this route was dark and secluded, a place that teenage girls should avoid. However, many teenagers in the city casually used this shortcut. On the same night, Sandra Ertman woke up around 4 a.m. and noticed that the light in Jennifer's room was still on, which was unusual. Usually, when Jennifer came home, she would always turn off the light to let her parents know she had safely arrived and was going to sleep. Sandra assumed that Jennifer had stayed overnight at her friend Elizabeth's house without informing them. When her husband woke up a little later, he asked Sandra if their daughter had spent the night at Elizabeth's or Gina's house. Sandra replied that she wasn't sure. She wanted to cover for their daughter to avoid her father scolding her, but by 11 a.m., Sandra and Randy started calling Gina's and Elizabeth's families. The Pena family didn't answer the calls, presumably because they were at work. Around 1 p.m., Randy went to talk to Gina. She mentioned that she last saw the girls at 10:45 p.m. the previous night when they were heading to Elizabeth's house. Gina suggested that Randy should go together with her to the Pena family home. They did just that. Randy Ertman and Gina knocked on the door and even the windows of the house, calling out for Jennifer and Elizabeth, but received no response. Randy took Gina back home and returned to the Pena family's house. It was then that he finally met Adolfo and Melissa Pena. The parents of Elizabeth revealed that they hadn't seen the girls since the previous evening and assumed that their daughter was just sleeping in on her summer vacation, so they hadn't checked her room in the morning. They called the police, but initially, the authorities didn't take the disappearance of the girls seriously. In response, the families took matters into their own hands, printed flyers, went door to door asking neighbors if they had seen their daughters, but no one had any information. Adolfo came up with an idea to walk through the park since he knew about the short path to his house.
He walked across the railway bridge and the path where the girls might have walked. Something urged him to check near the tree line, but fortunately, he didn't give in to that intuition. 4 days of uncertainty passed when a call came into the Crime Stoppers hotline. An anonymous caller reported that the girls were in the park. Officers immediately began the search. At the edge of the wooded area, an officer noticed something resembling an item of women's clothing. As he approached, he realized it was not just clothing but the bodies of the girls. The victims were lying on their backs just a few meters apart, naked, and their bodies had already greatly decomposed due to the summer heat. Insects were present, making it even more difficult for even experienced police officers to look at the bodies. Initially, they wanted to keep the horrifying find hidden from reporters and the public, but the news spread rapidly. Randy Ertman was speaking with journalists about his daughter's disappearance when a reporter informed him over the radio that the bodies had been found in the park. Randy persuaded the reporters to take him to the park. Police officers had to restrain him as he attempted to break through the police tape, shouting, "She has light hair. Tell me one of them has light hair." He only stepped back when a detective told him that he couldn't provide any information yet and needed Jennifer's dental records. It was then that Randy understood the officers were trying to shield him from the sight of the bodies, an image he would never be able to forget. Dental records confirmed that the bodies found in the park belonged to 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman and 16-year-old Elizabeth Pena. The cause of death was strangulation. Several shoe prints were discovered around the bodies, indicating that there were multiple perpetrators involved. Now, when the girls were found, the police were determined to find those responsible for their deaths. Although it was assumed that the call to Crime Stoppers could be entirely anonymous, the police traced it back. The call led them to the home of the Kent family. The homeowner, Joe Kent, admitted to making the call. He listed several names and claimed that these individuals were the ones who killed the girls. Among them was his own brother, Peter Kent. The police searched Peter's room and found jewelry belonging to the girls, which confirmed Joe's statement. But what exactly happened that night? So, Jennifer and Elizabeth decided to take a shortcut through the park because they had promised their parents to return before the designated time. It was around 11 o'clock, and the park was not a particularly safe place for two young girls at that time. Nevertheless, they walked through the park and encountered two young men. The guys' names were Frank and Roman Sandoval. They didn't say anything to the girls, didn't attempt to harass, shout, or whistle at them. They simply passed by. It would have been wonderful if they had told Jennifer and Elizabeth about the gang meeting taking place in the park and advised them to turn around and go in a different direction. That would have saved them. However, the brothers just walked past. Soon after, they heard a woman's scream. Did they realize what was happening? Yes, of course, they did. But they didn't do anything. They just left. The twin brothers, Frank and Roman, had just attended a ceremony for initiating a new gang member, which was held in the park. 6 young people aged between 14 and 18 took part in the ceremony. Essentially, they were all teenagers. The participants included 18-year-olds Jose Medin, Derek Sean O'Brien, and Peter Kentua, as well as 17-year-old Efren Perez and 14-year-old Venancio Medin, the younger brother of Jose. The new 17-year-old gang member whose initiation was taking place was named Raul the Ariel. So, besides the Sandoval brothers, the 6 teenagers gathered in the park to initiate the new gang member. The initiation was quite peculiar. Raul had to fight with each of the guys for 5 minutes. He didn't succeed entirely, but they accepted him nonetheless. After the formal part, if you can call it that, the guys stayed in the park, drinking and chatting. Suddenly, Frank Sandoval had an uneasy feeling and insisted that he and his brother leave. Following the twins, 18-year-old Jose Medin and his 14-year-old brother were about to leave when suddenly Jose noticed Elizabeth. He attempted to grab her chest, but she pushed his hand away and wanted to continue walking. However, this was not part of Jose's plans. He said, "No, little girl,
"Where do you think you're going?" and put his hand around her neck, dragging her down the small slope. Jennifer was walking slightly ahead and had already passed the spot where the gang's initiation was taking place. She had every chance to escape and save herself, but upon hearing Elizabeth's cries, she rushed to help her. Not many would have intervened in such a situation, but Jennifer acted exactly like that. She saw only Jose and thought that she and Elizabeth could handle one guy together, giving her a real chance to save her friend. She probably didn't suspect that there were 5 more teenagers down the slope. So when Jennifer rushed back to Elizabeth, other members of the gang grabbed her and knocked her to the ground. The guys forced the girls to take off their clothes and underwear, and for the next hour 5 guys in turn, and sometimes at the same time, mocked Jennifer and Elizabeth. 14-year-old Venancio Medai and watched in amazement. Later, he will tell how the girls fought off their attackers. Jennifer bit the assailants, while Elizabeth kicked the air and screamed. They were, of course, weaker than the 6 teenagers, the boys, but they still did everything they could to escape. During the attack, the victims often looked at each other, which made them cry even harder. At first, Elizabeth didn't cry. She was more in anger. However, seeing what the boys were doing to Jennifer, tears started streaming down her cheeks as well. The boys approvingly patted each other on the back when they switched places and crudely insulted the girls. Even Jose dared to ask Elizabeth for her name and phone number while mocking her. 14-year-old Venancio Medina watched the attack in horror. When he asked to hang out with his older brother, he probably didn't expect anything like this. He also didn't want to participate in the relentless abuse, but he feared the other boys. So, after their instructions, he also mistreated Jennifer. It is reported that he was the only one who asked his brother and Peter Kent to release the girls, but Peter whispered to him that they saw their faces and could identify them. The leader of the group, 18-year-old Peter Kent, declared that they must not allow the victims to be identified later. The newcomer, Raoul, yelled at Jennifer, ordering her to kneel. He and Sean O'Brien began choking Jennifer with Sean's red shoelaces. But they tore apart, and they had to finish what they started with the girls' shoelaces. Elizabeth, who was forced to witness Jennifer's murder, pleaded with the boys to spare her, offering to give them her phone number so they could meet up and hang out if they let her go. She did and said everything she could to save her life. However, it didn't work, and Elizabeth made one last desperate attempt to escape. Unfortunately, she was intercepted. Peter Kent always boasted about his steel-toed boots. It was with those boots that he attacked the girl, breaking her ribs and knocking out several teeth. Then, Peter, Jose, and Efren strangled Elizabeth with shoelaces. At that moment, they noticed Jennifer was still alive, and they started stomping on the victims' bodies and necks to ensure their demise. It was a monstrous murder of the girls, who simply wanted to take a shortcut so their parents wouldn't scold them. Without a shred of remorse, the killers divided the spoils, the few pieces of jewelry that belonged to Jennifer and Elizabeth. They even took the watch with Goofy, a Disney character that Jennifer liked. On the first ring was engraved the letter E, and Jose took the ring to give it to his girlfriend, Esther. After committing the crime, several boys went to Peter's place, where his brother Joe and his 16-year-old wife, Christina, were present. Christina noticed that they were covered in blood, disheveled, as if they had just been in a fight. They threw the bloodied items at her and ordered her to get rid of them. Christina asked what had happened, and Jose replied that they had just had some fun. Then they began relishing the details of what they had done, showing enthusiasm and boasting, without any sign of remorse. It disgusted Christina and Joe to hear this, but they pretended that everything was normal and silently listened. Christina herself had been a victim of violence in the past, and the actions of the gang deeply affected her. When the boys left, she told her husband that he should call the police anonymously. Joe was hesitant because it wasn't just about his brother but also about the other gang members who could seek revenge against him. However, Christina couldn't bear the thought of the girls lying in the park without their families having a proper chance to say goodbye to them. She convinced Joe to make an anonymous call to Crime Stoppers, ensuring that nobody would know it was him. The next day, Joe made the call in a hushed tone, informing the police where to find the bodies. Initially, the police didn't find anything, but after 4 days, a persistent officer eventually discovered the crime scene. Undoubtedly, Christina and Joe were very scared when the police traced the anonymous call, but they had made the right decision in doing so. On June 29, 1993, all 6 members of the gang were arrested. The red nail polish belt they used to try to strangle Jennifer was found in O'Brien's apartment. During the interrogations, the friendship between the boys came to an abrupt end. Each of them claimed to have been in the park, but others were the ones who killed the girls. The police pieced together the full picture of how events unfolded that night. Nearly all the details about what happened were known thanks to the testimony of 14-year-old Venanzio Medellin. The boys were tried separately, so the families had to listen to the horrifying details of their daughter's murders 5 times. Venanzio Medellin was the exception. He made a deal and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The other 5 were sentenced to the death penalty. In the cases of Jose Medellin, Derek O'Brien, and Peter Cantu, the sentences were carried out. Sean O'Brien and Jose Medellin found the courage to apologize to the victims' families, but Peter Cantu didn't even do that. Adolfo and Melissa Pena believe it doesn't matter, as he wouldn't say anything that would change anything. The sentences of Efren and Raul were changed to life imprisonment because they were 17 at the time of the crime, and the Supreme Court prohibited the execution of individuals who were younger than 18 when they committed the crime. The court proceedings were extremely difficult, not only because the victims' families had to listen to their daughter's torture 5 times, but also because the criminals' relatives accused Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents of allowing them to go to the park, even though their own relatives were drinking and fighting there too. Efren's stepfather approached Elizabeth's father and said in Spanish, "This is your fault for not raising your daughter properly." The most horrifying aspect of this story is that it wasn't the gang's first crime. Sean O'Brien, Peter Cantu, and Jose Medellin had already murdered a young mother, 27-year-old Patricia Lopez. She was waiting at a gas station for her husband to pick her up after her car broke down. The killers dragged her into the park, where they assaulted and strangled her with Sean O'Brien's red nail polish belt. O'Brien's fingerprints were found at the crime scene, and all of this happened 6 months before Jennifer and Elizabeth's murder. However, he was not charged for it. In addition to that, the criminals attacked random pedestrians on the street at least twice, including an armed robbery of another teenager and the murder of a completely unknown man. Despite the horror of the case, it had some positive consequences. Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents showed the world what it means to be a victim but not a helpless one. When the judge asked the parents if they wanted to address Peter Cantu, Randy Ertman immediately stood up and expressed everything he needed to say to Peter. Many criticized the judge for allowing Randy to yell at Peter. However, thanks to this, now after the sentencing, the victims' families have the right to address the perpetrator. They can also be present during the execution, which was previously prohibited. The families of Elizabeth and Jennifer visited the executions of the 3 killers. The families continue to fight for justice to this day. All 6 convicts appealed their sentences. Venanzio was denied parole 5 times, and each time the families met with the judges to prevent his release. Randy said, "I want this man to sit in jail for the rest of his life. I want this piece of crap to die in jail, and I will do everything in my power to keep him in jail. Do you want him as your neighbor? Do you want him living next to you?" Jennifer and Elizabeth had no choice. He had a choice. He could have walked away, but he didn't. Unfortunately, after his daughter's murder, Randy tried to find solace at the bottom of a bottle. But after 5 years, he pulled himself together, quit drinking, and started the path of healing. He and his wife moved away because everything in their hometown reminded them of their daughter. In 2014, at the age of 61, Randy Ertman passed away from lung cancer. Jennifer was his only daughter, and he fought not only for her but for the other victims as well. Thanks to him, other victims' families now have more rights and opportunities. Amidst the bustling city streets and crowded shopping centers, Lois Pearson always preferred the peaceful seclusion of a small wooden house nestled among green hills where she had grown up. Her family had lived there since her birth in 1949, and Lois hardly ever left her ancestral home. She lived on a modest income from leasing her land to a man who grazed his cattle on it. After her mother's passing, Lois found herself relying more on her own resources. A few years ago, when her pipes froze, she decided to do without running water and carried water from a well. In her daily activities, she used a single lamp, which she carried from room to room on a long cord. Every Sunday, Lois attended church, and once a month, she would travel to the nearest town, Mineral Wells, to buy groceries and do laundry at a self-service laundromat. She always felt more comfortable with animals in nature and often spent entire days without interacting with other people. Lois never had a boyfriend. She never even undressed in front of a man, not even a doctor. Lois met Jeffrey Maxwell in 2001, shortly after he acquired land in Weatherford, Texas, located to the west of her property. At that time, Maxwell was just under 50 years old, while Lois was slightly over 50. They exchanged a few words on occasion, and he would wave to her as he passed by her house. Once, Maxwell invited her to have lunch with him. The invitation caught Lois off guard, and she declined in her usual gentle manner. On another occasion, he came to her house, jumped out of his car, and out of the blue asked for a kiss. Lois felt offended, especially by the expectant smirk on his face. She demanded that he never come to her house again. In 2005, he moved away, but to her immense surprise, they crossed paths again before his departure. Their conversation was brief and unburdened. He stopped by to show her pictures of a modular home he was building in Corsicana and to bid farewell. Little did Lois know that this farewell visit would not be her last encounter with Jeffrey Maxwell. On the afternoon of March 1, 2011, Lois was preparing for her regular trip to town for groceries. She was getting ready to leave when a silver Chevy Trailblazer pulled up behind her 1970 Nova car. If he had arrived just 5 minutes later, he would have missed her. Maxwell warmly greeted Lois and smiled. He stepped out of his car and engaged her in a conversation about the church. As she replied, he began slowly approaching her, and she started backing away. Their movements quickly led them to the back of her house. Feeling slightly embarrassed by the nearby containers of well water, Lois attempted to steer Maxwell back towards the driveway. Suddenly, she noticed a strange shift in his expression. It was so evident that they both stopped talking. Maxwell reached into his coat pocket for a container with an odd lid and held it up to Lois's face. Before she could say anything, he released a stream of pepper spray, attempting to hit both of her eyes. However, the spray had no effect. Lois turned and ran toward the barbed wire fence near her car. Lois had barely reached the fence and put her hands on the top wire when he caught up to her. Grabbing her, he lifted her up, but she held onto the wire even as the spikes dug into her fingers and blood dripped from her hands. Yet he was too strong and managed to throw her to the ground in front of his SUV. Lois attempted to scream as loudly as she could, but her house was secluded and there was no one around. Maxwell picked Lois up again, put what seemed like handcuffs on her, and opened the back door of her house. She struggled to free herself as he pushed her into the kitchen. He grabbed a wooden rolling pin from the kitchen table, her mother's rolling pin, and struck Lois on the left side of her head. When she didn't fall, he swung again, hitting her harder on the right side this time. The blow sent her to the floor. Lois felt her eyelids swell almost instantly, but she continued to fight to escape until he grabbed a large kitchen knife. She sat down quietly, feeling the blood and dizziness. Maxwell asked where she kept duct tape. She remained silent. He repeated the question but got no response. He then cut the cord of her lamp into pieces and tied Lois to the living room door handle. He went outside to his car. He was gone for just a few seconds, but she managed to free her wrists. She had always had rather slender wrists. She jumped up and ran out the door in the opposite direction. By the time he returned to the house, realized she was missing and jumped in his car. Lois had already run a few hundred yards down the road, even with ankle cuffs on. Maxwell chased after her, braking right in front of her and blocking her path. He stepped out of the car with a gun in his hand. "Now we're moving on to Plan B," he said with a chilling expression on his face. He opened the back door of his car and pushed her inside, fastening handcuffs on her again. Then he used a small piece of duct tape to cover her mouth. "Are you a virgin?" he asked, grinning. That's when she started crying. He laughed at her tears, slammed the door shut, and got behind the wheel. As he drove away, he told her he would have to come back and burn down her house. Lois heard the car pulling onto the highway. She thought about trying to lift her feet so that passing drivers would notice her handcuffs and help her, but realizing the car had tinted windows and other drivers wouldn't see her, she felt utterly helpless. She considered hitting Maxwell with a tire iron, but she knew it would only enrage him further. She also thought about opening the back door and rolling out onto the road, but she couldn't find the handle. Maxwell heard her praying and promised that after he was done with her, she would stop believing in him. The car veered off the road. The terrain was unfamiliar to Lois. The abductor led her into the garage of a house and closed the door behind her. She surveyed the room, cluttered with a variety of items. There was patio furniture, a lawnmower, numerous tools, a washing machine, and a dryer in the corner. Maxwell unfastened her handcuffs. He began removing Lois's clothes, everything except her bra. He cut it off with a knife. Then he attached each of her hands to the ends of a steel pole suspended from the ceiling by chains. Without comprehending what was happening, she watched as he flicked a switch on the yellow control panel attached to the ceiling by a cable, at the same point where the chains were connected. She felt her arms rise first, then her shoulders lifted abruptly. The motor in the ceiling hummed as she ascended higher and higher. When Maxwell flicked the switch again, the motor went silent, and Lois felt her naked legs dangling helplessly in the air. Jeffrey Maxwell was known for his ability to escape from any situation, whether it was burning down his own house for insurance money or shooting cattle to avoid feeding them, or even something far more sinister. Maxwell could always manage to avoid punishment. He got to know Martha Martinez from Mexico through postal correspondence in the early 1980s. They exchanged letters for a long time, and eventually Jeffrey traveled to Mexico and proposed to her. Her family wasn't initially fond of him because he skillfully played on her insecurities and lack of self-confidence. Her family begged her not to marry Maxwell, but the 29-year-old woman believed that this was her chance to become a wife and mother. She married Maxwell, moved with him to Watauga, a suburb of Fort Worth, Texas, and gave birth to a son. This was Maxwell's third child. At 18, he had married his girlfriend Rita when she became pregnant, but they divorced in 1979 after the birth of their second child. Although Martha kept her husband's behavior hidden from her family, she couldn't hide the bruises on her arms and legs as if from shackles, from her friends, but this was nothing compared to the horror that Martha would experience later. On Sunday, April 19, 1987, a deputy sheriff from Ardmore, Oklahoma, called the police station in Watauga, Texas. He reported that early that morning, they found a woman on the road. She had been severely beaten, and she had lost a lot of blood due to a deep wound on her neck. The woman was Martha Maxwell. The police immediately went to the family's home and questioned Maxwell about the last time he had seen his wife. He claimed not to have seen her since the night before and expressed surprise when told that Martha was injured but alive. Fortunately, doctors managed to save her life. Upon regaining consciousness, she recounted how she and her husband had argued. He beat her and she fell asleep on the couch, only to wake up tied with duct tape. After further abuse, Maxwell forced her to drink a liquid that caused her to immediately fall asleep. She woke up in the hospital. Initially, Martha cooperated with the police, but after her husband's arrest and charges of kidnapping were filed against him, she suddenly stopped communicating with investigators. Without her testimony, the police couldn't charge Maxwell with anything, as a search of the house and car yielded no evidence. Jeffrey Maxwell slipped through the cracks again. Martha took her son and left for Mexico. However, her husband wasn't going to let her go so easily. He bombarded her with letters, playing on her Catholic upbringing and even accusing her of what had happened. Her family pleaded with Martha not to return to Jeffrey, but just a month after the charges against him were dropped, she was back living with him. It seemed like life was getting back on track for the family. Martha enrolled in college, and they bought a new house. But it was just the calm before the storm. On May 10, 1992, two family members received letters from her, or supposedly from her. Martha wrote that she was leaving her husband and son and didn't plan to have any contact for a while. Her family didn't believe that the letters were from Martha. Firstly, she usually just called them. Secondly, if she had written a letter, it would have been in Spanish, not English. When Martha's brother called Maxwell, he said that Martha had left and hung up. He had to come to Texas to file a missing person report for his sister. He was convinced that she was dead, and it was her husband's fault because she would never have left without money, documents, a car, and most importantly, her beloved son. However, the search for Martha yielded no results. Years later, when police asked him if he had done anything that might have led to his wife Martha's death, Maxwell replied, "Not intentionally." A few years after her disappearance, Jeffrey filed for divorce. Once the divorce was granted, he immediately remarried his first wife, Rita, and she and her 3 daughters from her second marriage moved in with him. Soon enough, the girls began complaining at school about their stepfather's advances, and Rita's best friend revealed that just 2 days before their wedding, Maxwell had assaulted her. However, it was only after police visited the family's home due to complaints from Rita's youngest daughter about her stepfather's behavior that Rita took the children, left the state, changed her name, and escaped. Lifting Lois into the air, Maxwell began yelling at her. He was still angry that she hadn't listened to him in the car. The woman felt his hands on her, then sensed something hard and pointed, reminiscent of a plastic bullet. It seemed he was trying to use this vibrating object to cause her pain, and it was truly painful. Stating that Lois would be with him for 2 weeks, Maxwell started hitting her, using different sizes of rods. He struck her everywhere, even on her chest, which was unbearable. Lois could do nothing but scream in agony. When he finally lowered her to the floor, she could barely stand. Maxwell led her to the bathroom and ordered her to wash up. At first, she caught a glimpse of bruises all over her body. Her right eyelid was swollen to the point that she could barely see, fearing she might lose her eye. The abductor himself quickly took a shower and gave her his jeans. They were oversized for Lois and smelled like Maxwell. It was terrible, but she understood that she would survive longer if she didn't provoke him over trivial matters. That night, he chained her ankles to the bed, turned off the lights, and lay down beside her. Lois couldn't close her eyes, and Maxwell hardly slept. Every time she turned toward him, she encountered his round, owl-like eyes, visible even in the darkness. Thus passed her first night away from home in over 40 years. When the morning of the second day came, Maxwell told Lois that he needed to go to the store to buy more padlocks. He led her to the garage and showed her a homemade wooden box. The wood looked and smelled new. He suggested to her a choice, a torture device or a box. Her decision was instantaneous. She would do anything, just not get on that machine. Maxwell inserted a metal ring into her mouth as a gag and secured it with a strap. Then he fastened handcuffs and shackles on Lois and ordered her to lie in the box. Through the gag, she asked if she would have enough air. Maxwell placed a wrench on the edge of the box, leaving the lid slightly ajar, and then left. Lois waited a few seconds after hearing the sound of his car's engine. Then she tried to get out of the box, but no matter how hard she pushed, she only managed to push the key away and lock herself in complete darkness. It was only when Maxwell returned that she realized he had moved the box under a heavy workbench. Upon returning home, the abductor led Lois to the bedroom and undressed her. Her parents had never discussed intimate matters with Lois, and she didn't know what he was doing, but she felt uncomfortable. When she screamed in pain, he asked her how she would like to go to the garage and hang upside down. After that, she tried not to make a sound. When he finished, he chained her legs to the bed again. That night, exhausted, she managed to get some sleep. In the morning, Maxwell had to go to Dallas to pay a bill for his son's repair. He put a gag in her mouth and chained her as usual. Lois could hear cars, motorcycles, and motorboats in the distance. She screamed and called for help, but because of the gag, no one could hear her cries. Only when Maxwell returned and removed the metal ring from her mouth did Lois realize that he had broken her front teeth. But on that day, she lost something much more important. On television, they showed a photo of her driver's license, and Maxwell allowed her to watch the news. That's how Lois Pearson learned that the house where she had grown up, holding so many memories, was no longer there, and she was listed as missing, and they were searching for her. The following days were similar, one to another. In the mornings, he satisfied his needs with her and then left her alone. For several days, he ensured she was chained to the bed, even when he quickly took a shower or went to the mailbox. But gradually, the abductor became less cautious. One day, she noticed he had left his mobile phone in the bathroom. The thought crossed her mind to take it and call the police. But she had never used a mobile phone before and was afraid she might do something wrong. She worried that he would not only stop trusting her, but also use that torture device again. Lois abandoned that idea, but she never stopped pondering an escape, or at least a way to shift the power balance. And after a week in captivity, she saw a way to fend off his persistent advances. On the 7th day, as he lay beside her and moved his mouth towards hers, she recalled her parents' words. They had told her that supposedly there was a bronchitis-inducing agent in her oral cavity.
This was one of the reasons why she never kissed boys when she was younger. So, she allowed him to touch her lips, referring to this maneuver as a battle of microbes. What actually happened then is hard to discern now, but the next day Maxwell woke up with a fever and chills. He was pale and could barely get out of bed. He didn't attempt to use her again. On the morning of the 8th day, he demanded that she write him a check for $500. He explained that groceries cost money and instructed her to date it February 2nd, more than a month earlier. He had already taken $60 from her wallet, which she had prepared for shopping in town, but she didn't object, hoping that the money would help her buy a few more days. It was March 12, 2011. The clock's hands were approaching 6 in the evening when Sergeant Ricky Montgomery and 4 other police officers pulled up to a modest house on the shores of a lake in Corsicana, 80 kilometers south of Dallas, to ask the homeowner a few questions about the missing 62-year-old woman. After her house had burned down and her remains were nowhere to be found, search teams began combing the surrounding area. Helicopters with thermal imaging were brought in for the search, but after a few days, the police came to the grim conclusion that they wouldn't find Lois Pearson alive. The efforts continued with search dogs trained to find bodies, and they even brought in pumps to drain 2 ponds, but the woman was nowhere to be found. Then, 8 days after the fire, $500 were withdrawn from her account. The check was made out to Jeffrey Maxwell and dated a few weeks prior. When the police found out that Maxwell also owned a blue SUV matching the description of the vehicle seen by a neighbor on the day of the fire, a judge issued a search warrant for the vehicle, and officers traveled over 160 kilometers to question the man. Sunday, March 12th, unfolded like any other day. The 12th day of Lois's captivity under Maxwell proceeded like usual. Lois sat on the floor praying while Maxwell watched television when they both heard a knock at the door. The abductor jumped up and quickly led Lois to a distant room, instructing her to stay quiet. Before he could handcuff her or put a gag on her, they heard another knock, even more persistent. The man hurried to the door. Lois could hear voices from outside but couldn't make out the conversation. She managed to escape the room, and through the window, she saw the word sheriff on a car parked by the road. At first, fear immobilized her entire body, which surprised her. But then she realized it was her chance, and she ran. Jeffrey Maxwell emerged from the house and firmly closed the door behind him. He smiled at the police officers, and in an apologetic tone said that his house was in a terrible mess. Sergeant Ricky Montgomery explained that they were questioning people who knew Miss Lois Pearson, or those who had recently been in the vicinity of her house. Maxwell replied that Lois was his neighbor, but he hadn't seen her in a long time. He added that Lois had sent him a check because she owed him money. Montgomery continued to ask Maxwell if he would be willing to come to the sheriff's office when the door swung wide open. They heard a weak voice of an older woman. The woman appeared frail, hunched over, her unkempt hair tangled, and her face covered in bruises. She swiftly slipped past Maxwell and approached the officers. Although Montgomery had a photograph of the missing woman, he didn't recognize her. "Who are you?" he asked. Before she could answer, one of the officers behind Montgomery exclaimed in surprise, "It's her, Lois Pearson," she confirmed. Everyone present was momentarily stunned. Regaining their composure, the police officers handcuffed Maxwell. At first, the woman told the officers that Maxwell had been her friend and hadn't done anything to her. Later, she learned about the term Stockholm Syndrome, but all she remembers about her rescue is the fear for her life. After a few minutes, when Maxwell was taken away, Lois told the officers that he had kidnapped her, beaten her, and done things to her that she didn't want. At first, the officers didn't understand what she meant when she mentioned the machine, but as soon as they searched the house, they found the device she described and a yellow control device covered in blood. They also found whips, handcuffs, weapons, 4 adult toys of varying sizes, and numerous pieces of adhesive tape throughout the house. Blood was on the bedding, on the floor in front of the car, and on various items of clothing in the house. The police also discovered an extensive collection of adult films. 3 days of questioning later, Maxwell confessed to nearly everything. The trial began on February 14, 2012. In the months between his arrest and the trial, Maxwell lost over 60 pounds and shaved his beard. Now he appeared as a lanky, ghostly figure in an ill-fitting suit. The jury took less than an hour to find Maxwell guilty on all 3 counts. The judge had prohibited mentioning his wife Martha's disappearance during the trial,
But the jurors heard from Rita's friend, whom Maxwell had assaulted 2 days before their wedding. Testimonies were also given by Rita's daughters, who described the impact of stepfather's advances on them. Lois also testified in court. She had always been shy about speaking in public, but now she spoke firmly about what she had endured during those 12 days of captivity. She described the injuries that continued to trouble her even a year later and remembered the 3 cats, Bluey, Blackie, and a nameless kitten that had perished in the fire. Most of all, she thought that if she remained innocent throughout her life, she would be rewarded in heaven. Again, the jury took less than an hour to sentence the defendant to 3 consecutive life terms. The judge ruled that he would not serve the sentences concurrently, meaning that Maxwell would be eligible for parole no sooner than 119 years. After the verdict, a crowd watched as a deputy sheriff handcuffed Maxwell's wrists and shackled his ankles before leading him out of the courtroom. Normally, victims of such crimes don't want their names mentioned in the media, but after the trial, Lois told reporters that she wanted her story to be known so that everyone could hear how her faith had carried her through difficult times. Sometimes she wonders why he chose her. Perhaps Maxwell knew that if she disappeared from home for a few days, no one would notice. The perfect victim. Had he not made a mistake and not put her to sleep, someone might have searched for her. Someone might have noticed she was missing. After the 12 days with Jeffrey Maxwell, Lois was left with memories of her former life. He took away much more than just her home or the car she loved. He took her piano and her mother's sheet music. Now she no longer has a photograph of her father, and she's unsure if one even exists. Her church raised over $17,000 to buy her a small trailer. It's not the home she grew up in, but the old house was always cold in winter and infested with pests, while the trailer is cozy and warm. The church even gifted her a new piano, and she now has a phone. Lois Pearson still prefers the tranquility of nature, but she relishes the time she spends with her new friends. "Before this, I never knew how much I loved people," she confesses. In July 2019, an unprecedented scandal erupted in Romania, demonstrating how the police respond to calls to the emergency service. The call to number 112 was received on July 25th at 11:05. The caller, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Alexandra Masisanu, struggling to speak, told the operator that she had been kidnapped, beaten, assaulted, and was being held against her will in some house.
Alo?
Bună ziua!
Bună ziua!
Vreau și în legătură cu poliția.
Da. Ce s-a întâmplat?
Doamnă,
Nu vă numiți.
sunt domnișoara, am 15 ani și ieri am fost sechestrată de către un domn.
Cum te cheamă?
She didn't know where she was, but only knew that she was in the city of Caracal. Before the call was interrupted, the operator sarcastically asked how they would find her if she didn't tell them her location.
Mă cheam Alexandra, vă rog, veniți repede, nu știu unde sunt.
Cum adică nu știi unde ești? În ce localitate te afli?
În Caracal, m-a dus în Caracal, dar nu știu unde exact.
Păi dă-mi un de reper unde te afli în Caracal. Cum crezi că te găsim?
Fortunately, Alexandra called again at 11:06, and the operator once again tried to ascertain her location. The girl managed to provide important details. For example, she had seen a dam before the kidnapper blindfolded her eyes. He had a gray car, and she was being held in a very old,
Dilapidated house near a gas station. There was a lot of grass and bushes in the yard, as well as 2 dogs. She even mentioned a name and an address that she read from a business card she found and explained that she was calling from the kidnapper's phone. The operator relayed the situation to a police officer who continued to communicate with the girl. He told her to stay where she was because they were sending a team. Alexandra tried to provide more description of the kidnapper's car in the yard, but the police officer wasn't listening anymore. The schoolgirl called again at 11:12 and asked if they had sent anyone to help her. Another police officer replied irritably that the team had already been dispatched but couldn't reach her in 2 minutes. Alexandra begged the police officer to stay on the line with her because she was terrified, but he responded that they had other calls to attend to. "The team will arrive in 2 or 3 minutes, what the hell?" he added. The girl reluctantly agreed. Although the emergency services personnel knew that the kidnapper was supposed to return any minute, they inexplicably called Alexandra 9 more times, but no one answered. Not surprisingly, even if the girl had initially tried to discreetly place the phone back, the kidnapper now knew for certain that she had called the police.
12 hours after Alexandra's call, the police finally brought her father to the station, allowed him to listen to the emergency call, and asked if he recognized his daughter's voice. When the man confirmed that it was her voice, they believed it was not a prank, and only then did they begin their investigation. Unfortunately, the name on the business card Alexandra found belonged to a man who had no connection to the case, and the specialized telecommunications service couldn't trace the origin of the call. Technicians were able to provide the officers with a very wide search radius and 3 possible locations for the girl, but none of the specified locations were correct. At that point, the police turned to surveillance camera recordings to identify a vehicle involved in a similar case. Once they identified the driver, they surrounded his house. Despite not being legally required, the police applied for a warrant and simply waited. They received the warrant at 6 in the morning on July 26th, a staggering 19 hours after Alexandra's call. Only then did they knock on the suspect's house gate. Of course, they were late. Inside the house, they found Alexandra's clothes and jewelry in the car, the girl's earring, and in the yard, a metallic barrel with ashes and human remains. The man stated that he doesn't know any Alexandru Mashishano, and the ashes in the barrel remained after the fire he lit to defend himself from persistent mosquitoes. However, after a thorough examination of the barrel's contents, investigators found 6 teeth. The results of the laboratory analysis left no room for doubt. The teeth belonged to Alexandra. The police arrested the homeowner, 66-year-old Georga Dinka, a retired mechanic. Neighbors knew Georga as an aggressive and inhumane person. So inhumane that he had a special code for his rare visitors. 3 knocks on the door. He suffered from antisocial personality disorder, had been admitted to a mental institution 5 times, and his troubled childhood could have been a possible reason for his condition. Georga's father worked as a butcher, engaging in illegal meat trade, often killing and butchering animals in front of his son, forcing the boy to assist. This soon became routine, and Georga himself was already killing stray animals for his twisted pleasure. His father was a heavy drinker and frequently beat the boy, using belts, brooms, and even the hose from the washing machine multiple times a day. He also tied his son up with a wire to prevent him from going outside to play with other kids. Interestingly, later on, Georga started treating his own victims the same way. Not surprisingly, the boy performed poorly in school. However, when he joined the army, it seemed like his life was getting on track, and he found his place, until he assaulted another soldier who turned out to be the son of a defense ministry official. Expelled from the army, Georga returned home and got a job as a general laborer at a hospital. He worked there for 8 years before attempting to find work on construction sites in Italy. Once again, things didn't work out, as he was fired after brutally beating an Albanian worker. After attacking a young woman, he was deported from the country. Upon returning to Romania, he worked as a mechanic, drove taxis, and also collected and sold scrap metal. Despite his inhumane behavior and reclusiveness, he managed to start a family and became the father of 4 children. His wife, tired of his constant abuse, lived and worked in Italy. Sources close to Georga say that when his wife came to Romania for the last time, he severely beat her. All 4 children left their father's house. 3 sons chose to live with their mother, while the daughter settled in Timisoara. After George's arrest, she insisted that she had no contact with her father, whom she considered mentally unstable. So, as it appears, Georga Dinka was a recluse, living in isolation, and his behavioral issues couldn't resolve on their own. Another shocking piece of news shocked the public. Georga confessed to the murder of the second girl, whom he abducted in April, 2 months prior to Alexandra's kidnapping. The second victim of the man was an 18-year-old named Luisa Melencu. Until the age of 12, Luisa lived in Italy with her mother, Monica Melencu, who worked there and engaged in vegetable cultivation. However, in search of a better life and income, Monica moved to the United Kingdom, while Luisa chose to finish school in her homeland and lived with her grandparents. She dedicated a lot of time to her studies and was determined to get an excellent education to find a job with a decent salary to support her family. But she relied on her mother's support for the time being. On April 14th, her mother sent her money for sports shoes. Luisa went to an ATM in Caracal, but for some reason, she couldn't withdraw money. She called her grandfather to let him know she was on her way home and headed to the bus stop. However, since it was Sunday and public transportation was scarce, especially in rural areas where locals often complained about its unreliability even on weekdays, Luisa decided to hitchhike. Unfortunately, Georga Dinka was passing by. He agreed to give her a ride. Louisa struck up a conversation and told him about her failed attempt to get money from the ATM. Upon hearing this, Georga offered her 30 lei, approximately $7, for intimate services. She refused, after which Georga decided to take what he wanted by force. Meanwhile, Louisa's grandfather began to worry because he knew his granddaughter should have been home by now. He called her mobile phone, but she didn't answer. Recognizing this behavior as entirely out of character, he rushed to the police station to report her disappearance. However, the officers dismissed his concerns, attributing Louisa's absence to a potential romantic involvement. Left with no choice, Louisa's family started searching for her themselves, and her classmates spread information about her disappearance on social media. The next day, an unidentified man called Louisa's grandfather, assuring him that Louisa was fine but didn't want to talk to him. He added that they were planning to go to Switzerland together. Not believing a word of the stranger's claim, the grandfather made multiple attempts to contact the police but received no assistance. Louisa's mother, Monica, traveled from the UK, where she had been living and working, and had somewhat better luck with the police. Only on the fourth day did the police begin an investigation which seemed more like mockery of the relatives. Louisa's grandfather was subjected to a polygraph test because they suspected him of withholding information. Finally, on May 30th, the case was handed over to the Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism, DICOT, which announced the opening of a criminal case on June 6th. They decided to investigate Louisa's disappearance as a human trafficking case, as they saw signs that she might have been recruited against her will for sexual exploitation. DICOT continued their investigation when news broke about the disappearance of another girl, Alexandra Masishanu. A 15-year-old teenager from Dobrosloveni was a student in the 10th grade at one of the top schools in Karakal. On July 24th, Alexandra left her home at 10 o'clock in the morning to meet a friend from Karakal. No one else saw her after that. The girl's parents quickly turned to the police, but the officers did not take their concerns seriously, stating that she was old enough to go out with friends and lose track of time. They advised them to wait. When the truth about the two murders came to light, the criminal inaction and negligence of officials and law enforcement personnel triggered a massive political crisis in the country. Many government bodies tried to demonstrate their activity, showing that they were doing their job, but it did not help them. The Minister of the Interior, the head of the criminal police, the director of the rescue service, the police leadership, and the prosecution in Karakal were all dismissed. The Prime Minister dismissed the Minister of Education, who cynically remarked that young girls should think twice before getting into strangers' cars, as if she were unaware of the problems with public transportation in the country and the fact that hitchhiking is sometimes the only way to travel in small towns. The police claimed that the Special Telecommunications Service employees could not provide more precise information about the origins of the calls, leading to their search efforts being focused in the wrong places. However, the police were also criticized for their slow and chaotic response. Frustrated, the grandfather of Louisa labeled them as criminals being paid by the government to not do their job. At the same time, questions arose about the remains of the murdered girls. Here is where the most significant mystery of this story begins. Georga stated that he burned the bodies. He scattered fragments of Louisa's bones in the forest and disposed of her clothes. However, he did not have time to do the same with Alexandra's clothes and body. Investigators reconstructed the crime scenes. Georga was asked to guide the investigators step by step to all the places he had been on the days of the deaths of Louisa and Alexandra. At this point, he started to contradict himself in his statements, allegedly struggling to remember what he did at the time. According to criminologists, Georga intentionally led them on a wild goose chase. Although he confessed to the two murders he was asked about, when he was requested to repeat his actions during the crimes and show where he left the remains, he panicked. This might be because he probably had a secret location where he hid all his victims. As there were likely more than two bodies in that hidden place, he led the investigators on a wild goose chase, pretending to be confused, not understanding and not remembering anything. Although fragments of bones were found in the forest, experts believed that the bodies were either in the Danube or the Olt River. In November 2019, while in prison, Georga began to write a confession detailing what he had done to Louisa and Alexandra. He started his account with the incident on April 14th, when he stopped his car as Louise was hitchhiking on the road. He agreed to give her a ride and engaged in conversation with her during the journey. He realized that he was becoming sexually aroused. His thoughts were consumed by nothing else but fulfilling his own desires. The man offered the girl 30 Romanian lei, about $7, for intimate services. When she declined, he struck her in the face and bound her with a belt. Interestingly, Gheorghe also blindfolded her so that the victim wouldn't know the way to his house. Does this imply that he intended to release her alive? After parking the car at his house, the man noticed his 36-year-old neighbor, Stefan Repeziano, in the yard. Stefan occasionally helped Gheorghe clean up the yard. Seeing a beautiful young girl in the car, Stefan asked who she was. With no other option, Gheorghe said that he brought her for intimate services, and the neighbor asked to join him. Gheorghe agreed. The men subjected Louise to humiliation and continued to torment her for 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Gheorghe lost his temper when the girl tried to resist him for the last time. He violently beat her and left her in a pool of blood on the bed, briefly stepping out to feed otters. When he returned, it was already too late to help the girl. The man didn't panic. He placed her in a metallic barrel and set it on fire, covering it with plastic and cardboard. Then, he went to sleep. When he woke up, he collected the ashes and fragments of bones and scattered them along the border of the nearby forest. Gheorghe's account of what happened to Alexandra was even more sinister. On July 24th, 2 months after Louise's murder, he noticed the same girl hitchhiking on the road again. Even though he was driving in the opposite direction, he turned the car around and offered her a ride. The story repeated itself. He offered Alexandra 50 lei for intimate services, and upon her refusal, he abducted her. He brought the bound girl to his home, immediately tying her to the bed and subjecting her to violence. The next day at 6 in the morning, Gheorghe was drinking coffee while his victim lay tied to the bed. The girl complained of a terrible headache and said she needed a painkiller. Gheorghe suggested going to buy some medication. Before leaving, he additionally tied her with ropes, wires, and a chain. In addition to the medication, he bought a prepaid card to call Alexandra's mother. Inserting it into the girl's mobile phone, he called her mother and claimed to be Alexandra's boyfriend, assuring her that everything was fine. Then he discarded the phone. The phone was later found, and some children played with it. The man returned home around noon. He saw that Alexandra had freed herself and was wandering around the house with his mobile phone. He struck her several times, causing her to fall and hit her head on the concrete floor, resulting in her death. The man wrapped the body in bedsheets, placed some wooden planks and chips, and a 2-liter bottle of Vaseline in a barrel and set it on fire. On top, he threw a thick cardboard. He also threw his mobile phone there. Then he went to sleep. He woke up early in the morning to the barking of dogs, as police were banging on his door. Despite the man's confession and the results of the DNA analysis, the families of Alexandra and Luisa refused to believe that Gheorghe killed the girls. And the matter was not only in the reluctance of the relatives to believe that they are no longer alive. In fact, there was reason to suspect Gheorghe of human trafficking and that the girls weren't killed but were sold for exploitation. First of all, in favor of this version is the fact that human trafficking is a very common phenomenon in Romania. Additionally, in 2022, Gheorghe recanted his confession. He confirmed that he kidnapped and mistreated Alexandra and Luisa, but then handed them over to a local criminal boss who sent the girls to a brothel in Turkey. The police allegedly protect this boss, so they tortured Gheorghe and forced him to take the blame for the murder, and they planted Alexandra's teeth themselves. The man's story seems far-fetched if it weren't for some facts. It's unclear why George didn't immediately try to dispose of Alexandra's body, knowing that she had called the police from his phone. Instead of that, he slowly cremated her body for a long 8 hours. Moreover, the burning of an entire human body should produce a very unpleasant smell and smoke. However, the man's neighbors didn't notice any smoke, smell, or anything unusual. The way Gheorghe behaved during the abductions shows that he knew step by step how to act. He knew how to select victims of a specific appearance, and the act of abduction itself seemed standardized. The series of potential crimes was only interrupted when Alexandra pulled him out of this familiar routine by calling the police. Furthermore, investigators speculated that Gheorghe might have had accomplices. The point is, right after the girls' disappearances, unknown individuals called both families several times, assuring them that the girls were all right. At least 2 of these calls were made by Gheorghe, but Alexandra's mother and Luisa's grandfather are convinced that 2 people were calling them. This argument that Gheorghe might have had accomplices prompted not only Romanian police, but also the FBI, Eurojust, and Italy's main anti-mafia agency to get involved in the investigation.
Additionally, it seemed to the relatives that the prosecution intentionally prolonged the case. In particular, the prosecutor received video material that indicated Gheorghe's car was connected to Louisa's abduction, but the prosecutor never summoned him for questioning or ordered a search of his car or home. After Alexandra's disappearance until July 27th, he didn't share the surveillance camera footage, which captured Gheorghe's car. Even then, he only showed them a single frame from the video where the car's license plate wasn't visible. Also, on July 27th, after searching the man's house, another accuser not only claimed that Alexandra was killed on that night, but also that strangulation was the cause of her death. However, how could he know this without the victim's body? Gheorghe hadn't made a confession yet. And finally, the most intriguing argument in favor of the possibility that the man might have been involved in human trafficking is that his daughter, Daniela Dinky, assured investigators and the media that she wanted nothing to do with her father and didn't communicate with him. But it turned out to be a lie. She did communicate with her father, and she has a criminal record herself. A few years ago, she was accused of connections to human trafficking networks. Following this, another revelation came in the story. Gheorghe Dinka's son, Dan, was once involved in a group assault and escaped punishment only due to his father's intervention. Allegedly, Gheorghe had connections within the police and the prosecutor's office. The victim was persuaded to withdraw her statement and the case was kept confidential. Equally important in this case is the question of whether Gheorghe's list of victims could be longer. Two girls were abducted under similar circumstances when trying to hitchhike, and they resembled each other in appearance. This points to a characteristic modus operandi of the criminal, relying on chance and showing an interest in a specific type of appearance. The man's inclination to commit crimes might partly be explained by his suffering from antisocial personality disorder. This condition is characterized by a constant pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction, as well as a lack of empathy, respect for the feelings, needs, or suffering of others, and a lack of remorse after offending or causing harm to another person. Some individuals suffering from this condition cannot form close relationships and use dominance and intimidation to control others. In this context, all the elements of the puzzle come together to form a coherent picture.
But what's surprising is Gheorghe's age, 66 years old. Criminals with a similar diagnosis usually evolve into violent killers during their youth. This disorder remains with a person throughout their life and doesn't appear and then diminish like other mental disorders. In other words, it's rare for a man to suddenly kill two girls with a 2-month gap at the age of 66.
Gheorghe most likely committed other heinous crimes in the past. It's unlikely that Alexandra and Louise were his only victims. Very unlikely. Gheorghe was charged with human trafficking, trafficking of minors, 2 cases of assault, 2 murders, and 2 cases of desecration of bodies. But he wasn't planning on surrendering so easily. Dubbed the Caracal Monster, he attempted to sue Romania in the European Court of Human Rights, pointing to a lack of evidence and claiming that he was treated unfairly during his arrest. He fought for a long time, but ultimately lost. On September 23rd, the 69-year-old Gheorghe was sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, 30 years of imprisonment. The thing is, for all the charges brought against him, he should have received 108 years in prison. But for individuals over the age of 65, the maximum punishment is considered to be 30 years. He is also obligated to pay compensation of 700,000 euros to the victim's relatives. The neighbor of the man, Stefan Repeziano, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the violence. In March 2023, Gheorghe once again caught the public's attention by declaring that he had repented and found God. He stated that he was able to forget and leave behind the entire ordeal. In contrast to him, the victim's relatives will never be able to forget what happened.